Chapter 1. Favor's ode, the tea, had gone cold twice, and Courtney still hadn't managed more than 2 sips of it. 3 days, Barbara said again, like repeating it might make the math work differently the 3rd time. You were just gone, Courtney. Still in your uniform, staff and all, not 5 minutes off a Justice League call, and standing right out there on the street. She gestured vaguely toward the front window, toward the ordinary stretch of sidewalk that had swallowed her daughter whole. And then suddenly you weren't. When we rushed down there, all we found was a residue of something. Pat and I stood out there for 10 minutes, just staring at the spot, like it might give you back if we looked hard enough. I must have aged worse than at any time in my life since I agreed to let you play superhero. I know, Mom. You know, she knows. Barbara looked at Pat like he might have a better word for it, and Pat, wisely, did not offer one. He was quieter than usual this morning, and if anyone at the table had been watching him instead of Constantine, they might have noticed he hadn't quite stopped looking unsettled since that first night in the basement when he saw Courtney with the staff. Across the table, John Constantine lit a fresh cigarette off the end of the one he'd nearly finished, which Courtney was fairly sure violated at least 2 rules of the Dugan household and possibly the laws of physics, given how little of the first cigarette he'd actually smoked. He hadn't touched his tea either, except to use the saucer as an ashtray once Pat's dagger look failed to register. "Ought to be grateful for the discrepancy, love," Constantine said. "Trust me. You do not want your time running parallel to wherever you've been. First rule of hopping dimensions, always check that the clocks match before you unpack." Mike, 16 and radiating the specific energy of someone trying very hard to look casual about the most interesting thing that had ever happened at this table, leaned forward. "So wait, how does that even work? Like, is there a reason it was 3 days and not 3 years? Could it have been 3 years? Could have been anything, mate," Constantine replied. "Could have been 3 seconds. Could have been you'd gone and come back before you left." Constantine shrugged, unbothered by the sentence he'd just constructed. "Time's not a river, whatever the poets tell you. It's more like a lot of very drunk rivers that used to know each other." "That's not comforting," Pat said. "Wasn't meant to be," Constantine replied, without a shred of courtesy. Courtney set her cup down. "Okay, so if you're not here to explain why I was gone so long there, but only 3 days here? Last I checked, you don't do house calls for tea and small talk." Something shifted behind Constantine's eyes, his nonchalant performance dropping half a degree, but enough that Courtney felt the room notice it too. He reached into his coat and produced a needle, plain, silver, unremarkable, except for the way he held it like it had already bitten him once and might again. "Because something's moving," he said. "Something out there that shouldn't be moving but is leaving a trail wherever it goes. I've had it on my radar for 3 weeks now. There are anomalies, small things mostly. A vicarage in Suffolk, where the shadows started running the wrong direction at evensong. A summoning circle in Prague that opened onto somewhere that wasn't on the list of somewheres it was supposed to open onto. And then," he turned the needle once between his fingers, "things got properly strange. I've got contacts down in the pit who don't rattle easily, and 2 of them have gone quiet in the last fortnight. Not dead quiet, worse, careful quiet. Hell has anomalies," Mike said, delighted in a way that made Barbara close her eyes briefly. "Hell's had a bad month, is what it's had." Constantine held the needle above the empty stretch of tablecloth, murmured something under his breath in a language that didn't sound like it wanted to be spoken by a human mouth, and let it go. It didn't fall. The needle hung in the air, spinning slow and lazy, and light bled out from where it hovered. Not gold exactly, more like the memory of gold, weak and cold, spreading into lines and points across the table like a map assembling itself out of static. Courtney recognized London, Prague, somewhere that might have been Cairo, and past the edges of the tablecloth, past the edges of anything that should have been mappable, the light kept going, into darkness that wasn't the absence of a map, but a map of somewhere that refused to hold still long enough to be drawn. "That's not Earth," Courtney said quietly, watching one of the far points pulse. No, Constantine agreed. That's the interesting part. Pat leaned in over his glasses, studying the pattern with the same expression he wore over a malfunctioning circuit board. Like the universe owed him an explanation, and he intended to collect. You're telling us something's moving between dimensions, not just popping over from hell to have a look at Suffolk. I'm telling you I don't know what it is yet, and that worries me a fair sight more than knowing would. The needle slowed, and the light guttered, thinning at the edges like a held breath. Whatever's doing this has been at it a while, and it's gotten bold enough these last few weeks that it's stopped bothering to hide the seams. That's not victory lap behavior. That's hunting behavior. Hunting for what? Barbara asked, and Courtney could hear the shape of the real question underneath it. Hunting near my daughter. Haven't the foggiest. Could be territory, could be a person, could be something with no word in English, since half of what's out past that line, he nodded at the map's fraying edge, doesn't answer to English rules regardless. He let the needle drop into his palm, and the light collapsed with it. The map folding back into ordinary tablecloth, like it had never been anything else. I'll be calling in a few debts, as I've come to know things, and some of them are going to owe me rather more candor than they'd like to give. And where does Courtney come into this? Pat's voice had gone flat in the particular way it did right before he started building something out of sheer stubbornness. She doesn't have to, Constantine said, and it was, to his credit, not a dodge. I came because whatever's moving, it's moving in the direction of places I can't reach on my own, and your girl's the only person I know who's actually been somewhere past that line and come back to talk about it. That's not nothing. It's also not a job for a 17-year-old, Barbara said. Mum, I know what you told us happened over there, Courtney, about everything you've said since you got back, and I'm so proud of you, I can't see straight. But that doesn't mean I want you doing it again. With him, she gestured at Constantine, without looking away from her daughter. No offense. None taken. Well, perhaps a fair bit taken, actually, but go on, especially when we don't even know what it is. Barbara stated ferociously. Can I come? Mike asked, in the tone of someone who already suspected the answer, and was asking anyway on principle. No, said three adults at once, and Mike slumped back, looking exactly as betrayed as he'd clearly hoped not to look. Courtney glanced at Pat, but Pat wasn't looking at Constantine, or at the cold tea, or at the fading warmth still ghosting off the tablecloth where the map had been. He was looking at her the way he had that night on the street, the instant after she'd vanished, only to find an empty space where his daughter had just been standing, and found himself searching it for an explanation he couldn't produce. He'd worked alongside a cosmic staff before, back with Starman for many years, and long enough to believe he understood the shape of what it could and couldn't do. He had never once seen it do that, never seen a portal open on its own terms, uninvited, and take her before either of them had so much as a second to react. No warning, no telltale hum, nothing in the readings he'd taken off it 100 times before that would have predicted it. It still didn't sit right, and it needled at him worse than he wanted to admit at a table full of people who needed him to sound certain. I'll come with her, Pat said finally, and it wasn't posed as a question to anyone at the table, least of all himself. Not to stop her, of course, as Pat knew Courtney's stubbornness rarely won him any arguments, but to keep an eye on the both of you, and Lord knows neither of you is going to slow down long enough to do it yourselves. Pat, Barbara started. I know, Barb. He said it gently, but there was no give in it. I know. He pushed back from the table, already halfway into the particular briskness he got when a problem had turned in his head into a checklist. I'm going to go take another look at Stripe. If there's any chance we're doing this again, crossing over to another dimension or world, then standing around a kitchen table asking questions we can't answer won't change anything. A man doesn't build a stellar exosuit and then not account for the stars. He didn't say the other part aloud, that he wanted an hour alone in the basement with the staff to ask it, uselessly. The question it wasn't going to answer any better this time than it had the first. Constantine watched him go, then looked at the needle still resting in his palm, its point catching the kitchen light. "Cheerful bunch," he said, to no one in particular, and reached for his tea before remembering again that it had gone cold an hour ago. Chapter 2. What she carried back. By the time Pat had disappeared down into the basement, muttering something about tolerances and thruster calibration that only he found reassuring, Barbara had made a fresh pot of tea, and Mike had planted both elbows on the table like a kid settling in for a movie. "Okay," he said. "Tell us the whole story for real this time and from the beginning. Not the 2-minute version you gave us the first night." Courtney wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at it for a second before she started, like she was deciding where the beginning actually was. "In this universe I was transported to, there was a war," she said finally. "A really, really big war. It was bigger than I don't even know how to make you understand how big. It's not like on Earth where a war is often just one army against another over some border, or the occasional world wars we've experienced that lasted for just a few years. This was the entire world, every country, every kind of person who could hold a sword or channel a weave against wave after wave of the Dark One's forces pouring up out of a place called the Blight, with all of it finally colliding in one last, enormous battle at a place called the Field of Merilor. They called it the last battle. And it happened about 2 years before I got there, and where the scars of it were still fresh in everyone's mind. Some of them still hadn't fully healed. 2 years, Barbara repeated. So you weren't thrust into the middle of it at least. Not fresh, but not old either. People still talked about it like it happened last week. Courtney turned her cup slowly. "There's this guy I actually got to know pretty well named Matt. He's sharp, funny, kind of a gambler. Definitely not who you'd expect just looking at him, and he ended up being the one who actually led the armies of light that day. He managed whole battles, coordinating everybody and every nation that showed up to fight. And while that was happening, there was another man named Rand who was off fighting the Dark One himself, one-on-one. Which I need you to understand, the Dark One isn't like some guy. He's the source of literally all evil in that entire reality. Their version of Lucifer, I guess, except somehow worse, because at least Lucifer's still just an angel. This was the thing angels would be afraid of. Mike had gone very still, and this Rand guy just fought him, beat him, and sealed him away again, instead of trying to kill him outright, because apparently you can't actually kill something like that, only lock it back up. There was also this whole 3,000-year-old prophecy about him being the one person who'd have to do it, the Dragon Reborn. No pressure, right? Mike blinked. Wait, hold on, back up. There's a prophecy, like an actual real prophecy, that the whole world knew about it. Thousands of years old, and given to numerous people over the ages, but finally compiled into something they called the Kara-Athan cycle. In the end, it was basically right, which is the part that freaks me out a little in hindsight, because the prophecy promised that the dragon would break them first, then build them up to save the world. Cryptic, I know. But that's, I guess, how prophecies go. Inevitably, he held back an entire dark army and fought literally the embodiment of evil in that reality. And he did it while she paused, searching for the least alarming way to phrase it, while carrying a lot on him. It's not a small thing being that guy. I don't think he's really okay in the aftermath, honestly. I don't think anyone who did what he did gets to be all the way okay. So he's like Superman, but sadder, Mike offered. Kind of, actually. Yeah, kind of like that, but more of a magical Superman than a physical Man of Steel. Courtney let out a short laugh, surprised at how accurate it was. There's also nations, a lot of them. It's not just one country, but this whole patchwork of countries. All these kingdoms and city-states with their own rulers and their own politics, and everybody's got history with everybody else. There are alliances that go back centuries and grudges that go back just as far. There's a queen in Andor now, Elaine, who's, well, I actually really liked her. She's sharp and doesn't miss anything. You could say she was raised to rule. There's also a whole nation of warrior men and women, the AEL, who live out in this brutal desert and have their own code about honor that makes night stuff look casual. There's an empire way out across the ocean known as the Sion-chan that's honestly kind of terrifying, since they have returned to lay claim to an empire thousands of years long dead. And if I'm being straight with you, they do some things I really did not love. And of course there's Aes Sedai, women who train for years, like a lifetime, to use something called the One Power. You see, there's two halves of it actually, Sedar for women and Sedin for men. And for the longest time, Sedin was basically poisoned, so any man who touched it eventually went insane and died horribly. That got fixed right around the end of the war, which is honestly one of the more incredible things to come out of the conflict. Anyway, Aes Sedai are organized into this ancient order that's older than most of the kingdoms themselves. They're not really wizards, not villains, not heroes, just powerful and political, and very, very good at not telling you the whole truth, even when they're not technically lying. Barbara was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly. It sounds like you were dropped into the middle of something enormous. I was. Courtney didn't dress that one up. I really was. Constantine reappeared in the kitchen doorway somewhere in the middle of Courtney, trying to explain the wheel itself, of ages turning, history looping back on itself, and the idea that this had all happened before, and would all happen again under different names. He walked in with his coat already back on, and phone in hand like he'd been reading something off it in the hall. "Sorry to interrupt story hour," he said, not sounding sorry, "but I've got to go rattle a few cages while there's still daylight to do it in." One of my contacts finally texted back, which is either good news or means he's about to ask me for something I don't want to give him. "You have a phone connection to the underworld?" Mike said. "Betrayed all over again. Demons actually text you. Everyone texts these days. Mate, even the damned keeps up appearances." He looked at Courtney, and for a second the performance dropped again, the same half-degree it had at the table. "I'll be a few hours, but could be longer, so don't wait up, and don't go anywhere with anyone who isn't me, no matter how convincing they sound." That's not me being paranoid. That's just good practice around this line of work. "Noted," Courtney said. "Cheers." And then he was gone, the front door clicking shut behind him with none of the drama he usually seemed to enjoy, which somehow made it land heavier than if he'd made an exit of it. It was another hour before Courtney finally climbed the stairs to her room, Cosmo in hand, the last of Barbara's questions still hanging in the air behind her. "And you're sure you're all right? And this Rand person, was he kind to you? And Cadsuane, is that a friend or?" Courtney hadn't had good answers for all of them. She wasn't sure she had good answers for herself yet either. She sat down on the edge of her bed and leaned Cosmo against the mattress beside her, and for a while she didn't do anything at all, except sit in the particular quiet of a room that had been exactly the same the entire time she was gone. Downstairs she'd talked about the war, the power, the kingdoms and the politics, and the shape of the whole terrifying, extraordinary thing. But that wasn't actually what kept surfacing now that no one was asking her questions and she didn't have to perform being fine. It was Rand's face the one time she'd caught him without the mask on. Not the dragon reborn, not the symbol, just a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in a year and wasn't sure he was allowed to. It was Cadsuane's voice, dry as old paper, somehow managing to be a threat and a compliment in the same sentence, and the strange, gruff warmth Courtney had come to realize was buried somewhere under all of it. It was Logain, a man who'd spent years being feared and hunted for something he never asked to be able to do, and the specific, careful way he'd looked at her like she was proof something could still be trusted. It was smaller things, too. A soldier who'd shared rations with her without being asked. A woman in a ruined town who'd hugged her so hard it knocked the breath out of her and never learned her real name. She'd told Barbara and Mike about a war. What she actually missed was the people who'd fought it. They asked me to come back, she thought, turning that over slowly. From Cadsuane's version of an invitation, brusque and unmistakably genuine, to Logan's quieter, almost embarrassed to be offering one. Rand's simplest of all because it was nothing more than a look. and at the end that said the door was open if she ever wanted to walk back through it. She hadn't expected 3 days ago that any of it would matter again this soon. Cosmo hummed, low and almost too faint to notice, and Courtney rested her hand against the shaft without really thinking about it. An old habit she had acquired, which provided comfort more than communication. "You feel it too, huh?" she murmured. Whatever's got Constantine's contacts spooked. Cosmo didn't answer. Because Cosmo didn't do that. Not out loud, not in words she'd ever heard, not in 3 years of carrying him everywhere she went. He just hummed, and after a moment went quiet again. Courtney sat with the silence for a while longer, trying to build the shape of a threat out of pieces that didn't fit together yet. An entity that could cross between worlds and which even rattled things down in hell itself that Constantine wouldn't name because he didn't have a name to give it. She turned it over from every angle she could think of, trying to fit it against everything she'd learned in that other universe and against everything she knew from home, against every villain she'd ever squared off with in either place. But nothing fit, not cleanly, not even close. She was still turning it over, no closer to an answer when she finally gave up and let herself lie back against the pillows. Cosmo propped silent in the corner, and the last thought she had before sleep took her wasn't about the danger at all. It was Rand's face again, and whether, wherever he was tonight, he had any idea he was about to be needed for something that didn't just pertain to his world, but perhaps many worlds. Chapter 3. What the archives remembered. The nursery smelled of beeswax, and the particular sweetness of a room that had spent 2 years being kept scrupulously, obsessively clean. Late morning light came slanting gold through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, and on the thick woven rug beneath them, Tam Traken, not yet 2, and already possessing his father's stubborn scowl of concentration, was attempting, with the fierce dedication of a much older man laying siege to a city, to stack 4 wooden blocks on top of one another for what had to be the 11th time. His sister showed no such patience. Morghese had abandoned blocks altogether in favor of crawling determinedly toward the door, where Avienda crouched to intercept her with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. "She has her grandmother's stubbornness," Avienda said, scooping the girl up, despite indignant protest, "and none of her patience for staying where she is put." "Small wonder," Rand said. He was seated on a low bench that had clearly been built for exactly this purpose, close enough to the floor to be useful, but sturdy enough not to become a casualty of Tam's ongoing architectural ambitions. And he was watching his son's 4th block wobble and topple with an expression that had, these last 2 years, become rare enough on his face that both women in the room noticed it every time it appeared. Not the weight he still carried, nor the tiredness that never entirely left his eyes. Just a simple, quiet presence that didn't need words to communicate his feelings. "He is going to be furious with those blocks someday," Elaine said from the doorway, and both Rand and Avienda looked up. She had come from the direction of the throne room, still half in her working clothes, a stack of papers under one arm that she set down on a side table with the particular relief of someone glad for any excuse to set it down. "Furious, and then he'll solve it out of spite, and then he'll be unbearable about it for a week." "Sounds familiar," Avienda said, and Elaine made a face at her that had no real heat in it. Elaine crossed the room and settled herself onto the bench beside Rand, close enough that her shoulder rested against his, and for a moment none of them said anything at all. They just watched Tam glare at his blocks like they had personally wronged him, and Morghese's attempt, with great seriousness, to eat one of Avienda's braids. It was, Rand thought, one of the only rooms left in the world where he still felt like just a man. Not the dragon reborn, not a symbol 2 years dead, and still somehow expected to keep performing miracles. Just Rand, watching his children fail spectacularly at stacking blocks, with the 2 women who had never once let him disappear entirely into what everyone else needed him to be. It didn't last. A soft knock at the door, and a servant, young, nervous in the particular way palace staff got when they had to interrupt the Queen in her few private hours, bowed low. "Your Majesty?" Lord Rand, forgive the intrusion. Moiraine Sedai has arrived at the palace and requests an audience. Tom Merrilin accompanies her. Something in Rand went briefly, quietly still. Moiraine rarely came anywhere without a reason worth the travelling, and after 2 years of relative peace, a reason worth the travelling from Moiraine Sedai was not, as a rule, good news. "Send them here," Elaine said, already rising, already smoothing her skirts back into something resembling composure. No sense standing on ceremony with either of them. Moiraine looked, as she generally did, exactly the same as she had years before. Ageless, composed, the faint, knowing amusement never quite leaving the corner of her mouth, even when the news she carried was grim. Tom entered a half-step behind her, his cloak still faintly dusty from the road, and broke into a wide, genuine grin the moment he saw the children. "By the light," he said. "They've doubled in size since last I saw them." "They do that," Elaine said dryly, and allowed herself to be embraced first by Tom, who smelled of pipe smoke and old leather the way he always had, and then more carefully by Moiraine, whose composure cracked just slightly at the corners in a way it rarely did for anyone else. "You look well," Moiraine told her. "Tired, but well. Motherhood suits you better than I think you expected it to. Ask me again after a sleepless night and see if you get the same answer." But Elaine was smiling as she said it. Avienda greeted Moiraine with the clasped forearm grip of the Aiel, warm but unadorned, and Rand simply took her hand in both of his for a moment, saying nothing, which between the two of them had always meant a great deal more than it would have meant from anyone else. "You didn't travel 400 leagues to admire how large my children have gotten," Elaine said, once the pleasantries had settled, gesturing them all toward the low chairs arranged near the window. It was close enough that Tam could continue his siege on the blocks in full view, and close enough that Avienda was able to keep half an eye on Morghese without appearing to sit. "Tell us." Moiraine folded her hands in her lap, and whatever warmth had been in her face a moment before receded into something more careful. "I stopped at Tar Valon on my way here, and met with the Armelin to learn what progress had been made these past months regarding the shards." The word landed in the room the way it always did, a small, cold thing dropped into an otherwise ordinary conversation. Rand's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, while Avienda's grip on Morghese's small waving hand went very slightly firmer, though the girl herself noticed nothing at all. "And?" Rand asked. "I learned little, and some depending on how one chooses to measure it." Moiraine's voice was even the voice of someone who had spent a very long life learning to deliver difficult things without letting her own alarm color them for her listener. The shards themselves remained stubbornly uncooperative. Sisters, skilled in such work, have tested them against every known form of the power, against healing, against Tavran influence, against nearly everything the Tower's collective memory could suggest, and learnt almost nothing more than what was known within days of their discovery. Whatever they are, they were not made to be understood easily. "That's the little," Elaine said. "What's the much?" Two sisters of the brown Aja, the kind who find satisfaction in archives most of us would find unbearably dull, went looking in a different direction entirely. Not at the shards themselves, but backward, through the oldest records the Tower possesses for any account of something similar, and they found not an answer but a precedent. Moiraine chose her next words with visible care. There are references, scattered and old enough that most scholars had long dismissed them as corrupted translation or embellishment, suggesting that Tamaral Ailen, the great pattern as we have always understood it, has on rare occasion in the deep past been touched by forces that did not originate from within the world the light created. The room went very quiet. Even Tam, as though sensing the shift, abandoned his blocks and sat staring up at the adults with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Touched how?" Rand asked. His voice had gone low. "That the records do not say with any clarity. Nothing so precise as names or shapes or intentions, only that the pattern's weave showed disruption at points that could not be accounted for by any known source. Small knots, brief distortions, threads that bent in ways the wheel itself did not seem to have woven them to bend, and in every instance the records preserved, the disruption passed. The pattern absorbed it, as it absorbs all things eventually, and no lasting consequence was recorded. She paused. Whether that means such intrusions were always minor, or simply that the tower's memory does not extend far enough back to have recorded the ones that were not, I cannot say. Avienda's brow furrowed. You believe this bears on what's happened? On the shards. I believe it is the closest thing to a precedent that 3,000 years of recorded history has offered us, Moiraine said, which is either deeply reassuring or not reassuring at all, depending on how much weight one puts in 3,000 years being a very long time, and also, in the scheme of what may be out there, a very short one. Elaine let out a long breath and rubbed at her temple, the exhaustion of ruling 2 thrones catching up with her all at once. I wish Courtney were still here, she said, mostly to herself, though the room heard it. She always spoke as though her own world dealt with outside things on a regular basis. That, I suppose, is the only way I know to put it, almost as a matter of course. Not calmly, precisely, but as though it were a known danger with a shape people had learned to recognize, rather than something entirely without precedent the way it is for us. Rand said nothing, but something shifted behind his eyes, so faint that only Elaine, watching him from so close, and Avienda, who had spent years learning every register of his stillness, caught it at all. The particular quiet of a man arriving on his own, a thought he had not yet decided whether he wanted to say aloud. But surprisingly, this time he did speak on it. While talking about Courtney, I was reminded of her conversation with Cadsuane, and about the fact that she works regularly with aliens from distant worlds. One in particular is a man so powerful that he could break a planet all by himself, and a woman who is said to be born directly from a god. Moiraine, someone who has never been known to miss anything, allowed herself a small, deliberate pause before speaking again. It is ironic that you mentioned this girl, looking pointedly at Rand following his musing revelation, since it is the other reason that I have come to see you all. I have heard a great deal, second-hand, and in fragments, about this stranger from beyond the pattern entirely, this girl who walked among you these past months, and then returned to wherever it is she came from. I confess my curiosity has gotten the better of my patience. Tell me about her. And, she added, with the faintest note of genuine interest breaking through her usual composure, tell me about the staff. That at least broke the tension in the room like a held breath finally let go. Oh, you'll want to sit further back for this one, Elaine said, and for the first time since Moiraine's arrival there was real warmth in her voice again. Her name is Courtney, but she also goes by a nickname or codename of Stargirl, and her staff, which she called or has named Cosmo, and which in itself took me the better part of a week to stop finding strange, is as near as any of us could ever determine, at least a little bit alive. Moiraine repeated. Not channeling in any sense we understood, Avienda said. Not Sedar, not Sedin, not anything I could sense with the power at all. And yet it responded to her, protected her. Once, in fact, when she was in danger and could not call on it herself, the staff acted regardless. It moved, glowed, did what needed doing, as though it had made the choice itself rather than waiting to be asked. She treated it like a friend more than a weapon, Rand said quietly, and something almost like a smile touched his face. She even argued with it sometimes, and after using it, always thanked it. I don't believe she ever fully explained how it worked, and I came to suspect it was because she didn't entirely know herself. Tom, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, leaned forward with the unmistakable gleam of a gleeman who had just been handed, unearned and unasked for, the beginning of an excellent story. A living staff, a girl from beyond the wheel itself, and a battle none of you can fully explain yet. He spread his hands. Moiraine, I believe I would very much like to stay a few days longer than we'd planned. I rather thought you might, Moiraine said, and for just a moment, Something almost like amusement crossed her face before settling, inevitably back into the careful stillness of a woman who had come bearing questions with no comfortable answers and knew there were more still to be asked. Chapter 4. Favors called in. Zatanna's dressing room smelled like hairspray, old velvet, and the particular ozone tang that followed her around, whether she was performing or not. She was still in half her stage makeup when Constantine let himself in without knocking, which she'd stopped being surprised by roughly a decade ago. "You know there's a door for that," she said, not looking up from the mirror. "It even opens. Where's the fun in that?" He dropped into the chair across from her, uninvited, and lit a cigarette she was fairly sure violated the venue's contract as much as his presence did. "Need your ears, Z, not your tricks, just what you've heard." That got her attention. She set down her eyeliner and turned to face him properly, and whatever performance had been left over from the second show dropped away entirely. Heard where? Anywhere. Everywhere. "I've had 3 weeks of anomalies stacking up and getting stranger, and hell's gone quiet in a way I don't like. And I'm hoping you've picked something up on whatever's left of the grapevine that I haven't." Zatanna was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "There's been noise," she admitted finally. "Not loud, more like you know how a room goes still right before a storm, and you can't point to any one thing that changed. You just know it's been like that for me the last couple weeks. Spells that should hold steady wobbling for no reason. A summoning I did Tuesday that opened half a second slower than it should have, like something was leaning on the other side of the door." She frowned. "I didn't think much of it, as I figured it was just me." "It's not you." "Yeah." She said it like she'd already half suspected as much and hadn't wanted to be right. "You have a name for it yet?" "Not even close. That's rather the problem." Constantine exhaled a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Whatever it is, it's not announcing itself. It's testing doors. I need to know if anyone in your circles has actually seen something, not just felt the temperature drop. I can ask around carefully." Zatanna's eyes narrowed. "John, if this is as big as you're being cagey about, you don't need to do this alone." "Never said I was doing it alone, love." He stood already halfway to the door. "Got a girl you're acquainted with that has a magic staff and an attitude problem lined up to boot. Don't worry, love, you're not off the hook either. I'll be back around for whatever you dig up. You're an absolute menace," Zatanna called after him, not without affection, as the door swung shut behind him. Papa Midnight's club didn't open for hours yet, but the door was unlocked. The way it always was for the handful of people Midnight considered worth the inconvenience. Constantine found him behind the bar, polishing a glass that was already spotless, which was as close as the man ever came to looking idle. "You look like a man who wants something," Midnight said, not glancing up, observant as ever. "Sit. Whatever it is, I assume it's not small or you'd have just called." Constantine took the stool across from him and got straight to it. The anomalies, the quiet in hell, the map he'd pulled that morning that had shown an edge of the world that shouldn't have had an edge at all. Midnight listened without interrupting, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if he'd laughed the whole thing off. "I don't know what it is," Midnight said, finally, setting the glass down. "But I know what it isn't. It isn't one of the old players making a move. Not the deuce, not Nurgle's lot, not anyone whose name I'd recognize on a bad night. Whatever's stirring, it doesn't smell like hell to me, Constantine. It smells like something that's been near hell or adjacent to it. Like something or someone wearing some of their habits without actually belonging to the family." He tapped one finger against the bar, slow and deliberate. "There's a difference between a wolf and something that's learned to walk like one. You'd do well to remember that before you go hunting it like it's just another wolf. Cheerful as always. I didn't get old in this business by being cheerful." Midnight reached beneath the bar and produced a small, folded scrap of parchment that was worn soft at the creases like it had changed hands more than once. "One of my people picked this up off a low-level conjurer 3 nights back before the fool went and got himself killed for his trouble. Not by me, before you ask," waving off Constantine's sudden raised eyebrow. "It looks like some kind of sigil. Not one I recognize, and I recognize most. So it might mean nothing, or it might just be worth showing to someone who'd know an old thing dressed up as a new one when they saw it. Constantine took it, turning it over once, and felt something in his gut go tight and cold in a way 3 weeks of vague unease hadn't quite managed until now. Cheers to you, Midnight. I owe you one. You owe me several, and I keep a ledger. But there was no real edge in it, and Constantine was already moving toward the door, parchment tucked away, mind already 3 steps ahead. The alley behind St. Bartholomew's wasn't the sort of place anyone wandered into by accident, and Chantinelle was waiting there exactly where she always waited, half in shadow, with her wings, when she let them show at all, folded tight and close, like she was still cold from a place that had never once been warm. "You look worried," she said, by way of greeting. "I look devastatingly handsome, same as always. You're mistaking the two? I've known you a long time, John." She tilted her head, and for a moment something ancient and tired passed behind her eyes. "This is worried." He showed her the sigil, and she went very still, the particular stillness of someone deciding how much of the truth to give before she'd decided how much of it she trusted him with. "I don't know this mark," she said eventually, "but I know its shape. It isn't a summoning sigil, and it isn't a binding. It's a seam marker, the kind you'd use to hold a wound open. Something that doesn't want to close, or you want it kept from closing." She looked up at him. "Something somewhere is propping open a door, John, and whatever's on the other side of that door isn't from where you think it's from. Hell's had a bad month. Midnight says whatever's moving smells like it's been near hell without belonging to it." Near hell, Chantinelle's mouth twisted, as if she tasted something bitter, and knowing what it was. There are things that visit hell the way a tourist visits a battlefield, things that are curious and untouched by the actual grief of it. If something's been walking those halls without ever truly belonging to them, without ever having fallen the way I fell, the way anything of hell's own lineage falls, then it isn't hell's business at all. It's using hell as a convenient shape to wear, a mask that fits well enough to pass. "Any idea whose face is under the mask?" "No." She said it plainly, with no pride in the admission, only unease. "And that troubles me more than almost anything has in a very long time, John. I have walked both sides of that divide. I know most of what wears a face in the dark places of this world. I do not know this one." She pressed the sigil back into his hand, like she didn't want to hold it a moment longer than necessary. "Go carefully, and go to someone with a longer memory than mine, if you can. Mine only stretches back to my own fall, and this may reach further than that. Gabriel did not meet him in alleys or clubs or dressing rooms. Gabriel met him, when he deigned to meet him at all, in the thin, colorless space between one heartbeat and the next. A place that was technically nowhere, and Constantine had never once enjoyed the crossing. "You look like a man who's been slumming," Gabriel said in the tone of someone delivering both an insult and a simple fact. Occupational hazard. "Talk to a bloke like you, one has to lower oneself accordingly." Gabriel's expression didn't so much as flicker. Angels, in Constantine's experience, found his sense of humor about as amusing as a stone finds rain. He held out the sigil anyway, and for the first time in the exchange, something behind Gabriel's ancient, unreadable eyes actually sharpened. "Where did you get this?" "First off, a dead conjurer by way of a man who owes me favors, then by way of a fallen angel who didn't recognize it either." Constantine mused, "which, in my experience, is the point where I start getting properly worried." Gabriel studied the mark for a long moment, and when he spoke again, some of his usual contempt had drained out of his voice, only to be replaced by something Constantine liked considerably less. "This is not a mark of hell nor of heaven, nor of anything that has ever held true citizenship in the war between them. It is older than that argument, and stranger. It marks a place where the boundary between what is real and what is merely adjacent to real has been worn thin." Gabriel continued deliberately, patiently, over what I would guess is a considerable span of time. "Adjacent to the real. That's comforting. It was not meant to comfort you." Gabriel handed the sigil back, and Constantine had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of an angel being genuinely reluctant to keep holding something a moment longer than necessary. I have heard in places even I do not often go of a vacancy. A vacancy created when a very great darkness that was sealed away in a reality far from this one came at a cost that reshaped the very fabric of that world. Such an event does not merely happen and end, Constantine. It leaves a wound in the world it happened to, and wounds, if left untended, do not always stay closed. Constantine went very still. You're telling me this is coming from somewhere else? From another world entirely? I am telling you that whatever wears this mark did not begin its work on Earth, and will not end it here either, if it is left unanswered. Gabriel's gaze was level, unblinking, entirely without the theatrical menace Constantine half expected from him, and entirely more unsettling for the lack of it. If you mean to understand what you are hunting, you will need more than what Earth or hell or heaven can tell you. You will need answers from the world where that wound was made. I would suggest you find a way to reach it, and quickly, John. Whatever this is, it did not choose its moment carelessly. It rarely does. Constantine came back through into the ordinary, colourless grey of a London alley, with the sigil still clutched in one fist, and the taste of somewhere that wasn't quite anywhere, still bitter on the back of his tongue. He stood there a moment, working through it. Zatanna's unease, midnight's wolf, that walks like a wolf metaphor, Chantinel's seam marker holding a wound open, and now Gabriel plain and blunt as a slammed door, telling him the answer wasn't here at all. Another world entirely, he thought, not for the first time that week, of a girl with a golden staff who'd already been to one. Right then, he muttered to no one, flicking the remains of his cigarette into the gutter. Guess we're going to need to borrow a few more hands. Chapter 5. Borrowed hands. Okay, but if you had to fight on just one, which would you pick? Trolloc or Myrddraal? Mike, you don't want to fight either of those. That's the whole point. I know, hypothetically. Come on! Courtney stabbed at her eggs, considering it with more seriousness than the question probably deserved, and mostly because it meant she got to keep talking about it. Trollocs. They're strong, but they're dumb, and there's a lot of them so you can pick your fights. A Myrddraal doesn't blink, doesn't breathe, at least I don't think, and it can see you even when you can't see it in the dark, which is deeply unfair, and I have complaints. That's so metal. Mike had abandoned all pretense of eating several minutes ago. Okay, next one. Best sword fighter you saw. Better be Rand, right? Rand's got to be the best. Actually, Courtney pointed her fork at him. No, there was this one man who's now king of a land called Malkia, who defeated one of the Forsaken believed to be the best or one of the best swordsmen to have ever lived. Barbara, refilling her own coffee at the counter, shot Courtney a look that was trying very hard to be stern and mostly failing under the weight of how genuinely entertained she was. You two do know there's a whole world out here that doesn't involve sword fighting and monsters. Boring, Mike said, and Courtney laughed hard enough. She had to set her fork down. It was, Courtney thought, the first morning in days that had felt properly, uncomplicatedly normal. Sitting there while her eggs go cold, Mike peppering her with increasingly ridiculous hypotheticals, and her mother pretending to disapprove while clearly enjoying every second of it, felt more at home than she could have imagined. Even Pat, working through his own plate at the end of the table, had the ghost of a smile on him he hadn't quite managed the last few mornings. It didn't last a knock at the front door, sharp, familiar, unmistakably impatient, with Barbara's shoulders instantly going rigid before anyone had even gotten up to answer it. "That'll be him," she said, in a tone that suggested breakfast, as far as she was concerned, had just officially ended. Constantine let himself in without waiting for an invitation, same as he always did, with his coat still smelling faintly of somewhere that wasn't quite London and wasn't quite anywhere else Courtney had a name for. He looked, she thought, like a man who hadn't slept, which, given what she'd learned about his relationship to sleep over the last several days, probably meant he hadn't. "Right," he said, dropping into the one open chair at the table without being asked. "No time for tea today." So I'll give you the highlights and save the dramatics for another morning. I've spent the last 2 days calling in every favor I've got left standing. And I've got answers. Answers I don't much like, but answers. Go on, Pat said. Something's found a way to prop a door open, a seam, a wound, whatever word you fancy, between this reality and somewhere it's got no business being. It's not from hell, and it isn't from heaven either, before anyone gets hopeful. He paused a moment. And an angel who doesn't hand out information for free told me, in about as many words as an angel ever uses, that this thing didn't start its work here. He looked directly at Courtney. It started somewhere else. Somewhere that had a very great darkness, sealed away not too long ago, at a cost that left a proper wound in the world behind it. The table went quiet. Courtney felt something cold settle low in her stomach, even before she'd fully worked out why. The last battle, she said. The dark one? That'd be my guess, love, yeah. Absolutely not. Barbara's voice cut through the room before anyone else could speak, flat and immediate. All the warmth of breakfast gone out of it entirely. No, whatever this is, whatever it means, she is not going back there. Mum, you were gone, Courtney. I don't care that it was 3 days here. It wasn't 3 days for you, and I'm not allowing you to do that again. I'm not standing on that street, not knowing if you're coming back. It's not the same as before, Courtney said, as gently as she could manage while her pulse was doing something complicated. Before I didn't have a choice, she said. That first time I got yanked through a portal with no warning and no way home. This time Cosmo's got a direct line. It knows the way there and the way back, she continued. It wasn't guessing last time. It knew. It just never told me. That's different. That's not falling through a hole in the world. That's walking through a door I know is going to open again. She's not wrong, Constantine said. I've seen what that staff can do when it puts its mind to it, and I do mean that literally, which is a conversation for another day. It's not some half-mad gate flinging her wherever it pleases sentience. It's precise and deliberate. That matters. It matters that she'd be walking straight toward whatever this is, Barbara said. Whatever's already unsettled enough to make hell go quiet. Aye, and that's exactly why we need people who actually know that world, Constantine said. I'm not proposing Courtney march in alone to sort out a problem 3,000 years in the making. I'm proposing we go get the people who already fought a war like it once and lived to tell of it. We get people who know that world and that pattern of theirs better than anyone in this world. We're not walking in blind, Barbara. We're walking in with the best possible company we could ask for. Barbara didn't answer right away. She looked at Courtney for a long moment, really looked the way she had the very first night. Courtney had come home changed, and neither of them had known quite how to talk about it yet. Pat, she said finally, without looking away from her daughter, tell me you're going. I'm going, Pat said, with no hesitation in it at all. Wherever she goes, I go. That was true before any of this, and it's still true now. He reached over and put a hand briefly over Barbara's on the table. I'll watch her, Barb, every step. You know I will. Barbara closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, something in her had settled, not happy, not even close to happy, but resolved. I hate this, she said. I want that on the record. I hate every part of this. She looked at Courtney. But I'm not going to be the reason you didn't go if going is what's right. Just come back. All of you. That's the only condition I've got. That's the plan, Courtney said quietly. Mike, who had been unusually silent through the whole exchange, finally spoke up. I'm staying here, aren't I? Somebody needs to mind the garage and keep an eye on this side of things while we're gone, Pat said, in a tone that made it sound like an assignment rather than a consolation prize, which Courtney suspected was entirely intentional. That's not nothing, Mike. That's important. Mike didn't look thrilled, but he nodded, and Courtney caught the small, grateful look he gave Pat for not just brushing him off outright. The back room of Pat's garage had never looked quite like this before. Stripe stood at its center, freshly repositioned from wherever Pat had been tinkering with him the last 2 days, its plating gleaming under the fluorescent lights, with a scatter of tools and diagnostic cables still trailing from an open panel in his chest. "Moved him in here last night," Pat said, running a hand along one arm of the suit with the particular pride of a man who'd been up far too late doing exactly this. "And I made a few changes. Most of it's the usual reinforcing plating, recalibrating the servos. But there's one thing I want to test before we go anywhere, and I want to test it now, and not find out it doesn't work standing in the middle of some other universe." "Which is?" Courtney asked. "Whether he can take a charge from Cosmo." That got everyone's attention, Constantine included, who raised an eyebrow with something that looked almost like genuine interest. "Gasoline's not likely to be available where we're going," Pat said. "No combustion engines, probably no refineries. Nothing I can siphon out of a truck if Stripe runs low. If we're over there any real length of time, I want a power source that doesn't depend on finding a gas station that doesn't exist. Your staff's already shown it can do things nobody fully understands, so I want to know if powering a Stripe is one of them." Courtney looked down at Cosmo, who, as far as she could tell, which admittedly wasn't very far when it came to fully understanding what the staff got up to, seemed entirely unbothered by the proposition. "Worth a shot. What do I do? Just hold it steady near the primary intake here." Pat indicated a small panel just above Stripe's chest plate, "and let's see what happens." Courtney stepped forward and pressed Cosmo's head lightly against the panel. For a moment, nothing happened, and then a low golden light bled out from the point of contact, spreading along Stripe's plating in thin, branching lines like veins catching fire. From there, the suit's chest panel flickered, dimmed, then blazed to life with a steady, healthy glow that hadn't been there a moment before. Pat let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. "Well, I'll be damned. Handy," Constantine said, sounding almost impressed, which for him was practically a standing ovation. "That'll hold him a good while," Pat said, already running a hand over the readout with the satisfied look of a man whose gamble had paid off. "Better than I hoped, honestly." Courtney came back down the stairs a few minutes later in her uniform, Cosmo in hand, and something in the room shifted the way it always did. Once she looked less like a girl and more like Stargirl. "Ready?" Pat asked, through Stripe's speaker system, having already sealed himself in with the suit's newly charged systems humming low and steady. "Ready." Constantine knelt at the center of the concrete floor, and working with the quick, practiced economy of a man who'd drawn 100 glyphs in 100 worse conditions than this one, began chalking out a wide, intricate design. Circles within circles, and sigils Courtney didn't recognize threaded between them. The whole thing radiating outward until it nearly touched the garage's back wall. "This isn't the spell itself," he said, without looking up from his work. "This is scaffolding. Cosmo's got the actual door. It knows the address better than I ever could. What I'm doing is lending it a bit of extra push, making sure the door opens exactly where and when we want it to, and not somewhere adjacent that we'd rather avoid." He finished the last line and straightened up, brushing chalk dust from his hands. "Right now, everyone inside the circle." Mike lingered near the doorway to the front of the garage, arms crossed, doing a poor job of hiding how much he wished he were coming. "Radio if anything happens. Anything, I mean it. You'll be the first to know," Courtney promised. Constantine raised both hands, murmured something low and old in a language that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner, and Cosmo, resting steady in Courtney's grip, began to glow. Soft at first, then brighter, threading itself into the chalk lines at their feet, until the whole glyph lit up gold and impossibly deep, like looking down into something with no actual bottom. Then the air split. Light poured out from the center of the circle in a widening ring, not unlike the map Constantine had conjured at the dining room table days before, except this time it didn't stay still. It opened, spreading into an actual doorway, and beyond it, faint but unmistakable, Courtney could see green hills under an unfamiliar sky. "That's it," she said, her breath catching despite herself. "That's home. Well, the other home." "After you, then?" Constantine said. gesturing toward the light with something that might, on anyone else, have been called a flourish. Courtney looked back once at Mike, standing straight-backed and trying very hard to look like someone who wasn't worried, at the garage that had never once, in all her years living 2 streets over, felt quite this significant before, and then she stepped forward into the light with Cosmo raised and Stripe's heavy footsteps, along with Constantine's unhurried stride, following close behind her. The portal closed behind them with a sound like a held breath finally released, and the garage went quiet. Chalk dust was still settling on the concrete floor, and Mike, now alone, could do nothing but wait. Chapter 6. A familiar tower. The gateway opened onto the landing platform with a sound like a held breath, finally let go, and the first thing Courtney felt on the other side was the particular chill of Tar Valon air. That was clean, cold, and carrying the faint mineral smell of the river far below. The second thing she felt was several sword points drawn and leveled at the party before she'd even finished stepping through. The warders guarding the platform had gone rigid. The instant the light split open, steel out, stances low, the kind of readiness that came from men who'd learned the hard way that strange lights tearing open the air rarely meant good news. Behind Courtney, Stripe's heavy footsteps thudded onto the platform, and beside her, Constantine emerged, trailing a thin curl of smoke, utterly unbothered by the number of blades currently aimed in his direction. Then the lead warder's eyes found Courtney's face, really found it, and something in his stance eased, though the sword didn't drop entirely. "You," he said, "you are the stranger from the Black Tower business some months past." "That's me." Courtney held both hands loosely open, Cosmo resting easy but visible in one grip, a gesture she hoped read as not a threat rather than also armed. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance, but we need to speak with the Armerlin. It's important, and it's connected to the investigation I was a part of some time ago with the Aes Sedai." The warder's gaze moved past her, taking in Stripe's towering plated form, Constantine's cigarette, and the overall assembled strangeness of the group, and clearly decided that whatever was happening, it was well above his pay grade to sort out on a landing platform. "Wait here," he said, his sword finally lowering though not fully sheathed. "I'll send word." Cadsuane's study hadn't changed in the several months, or from Courtney's side of things, the several days since she'd last stood in it. Same severe furniture, same sense that the room's occupant found most social niceties, an inefficient use of everyone's time. Pat had stepped free of Stripe in the courtyard below, leaving the suit standing sentinel among a small crowd of deeply unsettled palace guards, and now stood beside Courtney, looking somewhat smaller without several tons of plating around him, though no less alert for it. "Well," Cadsuane said, looking over the assembled group with the flat, assessing gaze Courtney remembered rather too well. "You've come to us this time arriving with a strange entourage." "Merlin." Courtney inclined her head. Not quite a bow, but respect all the same. "This is Pat Dugan, who I told you about before as being my stepfather. And this," she gestured toward Constantine, who had draped himself into a chair without waiting to be offered one, "is John Constantine." Cadsuane's eyes settled on him and did not immediately warm. He looked, Courtney had to admit, exactly like the sort of man or woman who'd spent decades reading liars and fools on sight would be inclined to distrust. Rumpled coat, days of stubble, with a cigarette he had not asked permission to light, and clearly had no intention of extinguishing. "And what," Cadsuane said, in a tone that suggested the answer had better be good, "is he?" "He's a master of magic in my world," Courtney said. "Not like the one power, different rules entirely, but real and dangerous, even if you know what you're doing. And he's spent his whole life working with things that cross between worlds, between realities. If anyone from my world could actually make sense of what's happening, it's him." "Charmed," Constantine said, not rising, dipping his head with just enough irony to make it clear he knew exactly how he was coming across and had elected not to care. Cadsuane studied him for a long, silent moment, the kind of silence Courtney remembered from before, the sort that made grown Aes Sedai fidget. Constantine, to his credit, didn't fidget. He simply waited her out, entirely at ease. which seemed to interest Cadsuane rather more than it unsettled her. "Tell me why you're here," Cadsuane said finally, "and skip whatever charm you were about to waste on me. I haven't the patience for it today." "Fair enough." Constantine leaned forward, all trace of theatre dropping away at once. "Something's been working its way between worlds. Yours, mine, and I'd wager more than just our worlds. It's the same thing behind those black shards your people have been puzzling over, and it's older and nastier than either of our lots have a name for yet. Though I've got a fair guess brewing. I've called in every favor I've got on my end, and I've learned about as much as Earth alone is going to tell me. What I need now, or just as importantly what we need, are people who understand your side of it, who lived through your war, know your pattern, and might see something in all this that neither of us would think to look for. And who precisely did you have in mind?" Courtney answered before Constantine could. "Rand, Matt Cawthon, and if she'd come Nynaeve, she helped us before, back when the Circle first opened the doorway that pulled me here. She'd understand better than almost anyone what we're up against." Cadsuane was quiet again, longer this time, turning something over behind eyes that gave away exactly as much as she intended, and not one flicker more. "Matt is in Ibu Da," she said eventually. "We can send fast word to the Empress Fortuona and ask whether he might be spared, though I'll not promise how quickly an answer comes, nor how willingly she'll allow him to leave." A faint, dry note entered her voice on that last part, the closest thing to humor Courtney had heard from her yet. "Nynaeve, I'm afraid, is not available to you at all. She is in Malkia with her husband, and has been for some months. I'll not be the one to summon her back from that for this, not unless matters grow considerably more dire than they currently appear." Courtney's face fell slightly, though she tried to keep it from showing too much. However, Cadsuane's gaze sharpened, something almost approving in it. "Moraine Sedai came through Tar Valon recently on her way to Camelin, where she remains even now, along with her husband, Tom Merrilin. She has already been looking into this matter herself, asking me a great many pointed questions on the very subject you've come to raise. And I dare say she would prove considerably more useful to you than Nynaeve at this particular moment, given she's already 3 steps into the investigation and has much more experience than Nynaeve." Something in Courtney lit up, despite the seriousness of the room. "Camelin. That means Elaine of Yenda, and yes, even Rand." Cadsuane's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Yes, I imagine you'll survive the inconvenience." "I can survive that inconvenience just fine," Courtney said, and didn't bother hiding the grin. Constantine, watching the exchange with the faint, private amusement of a man collecting information for later use, reached into his coat and produced a small, tarnished coin, flipping it once, catching it, glancing at the result with an expression Courtney had learned not to ask too many questions about. "Camelin it is then," he said, tucking the coin away. "Sounds like a plan." The gateway pad sat in its own quiet courtyard, ringed by Aes Sedai, whose expressions ranged from professional neutrality to poorly concealed curiosity at the sight of Pat seating himself casually back into his suit, with the plates locking into place with a series of heavy clicks that echoed off the surrounding stone. Cadsuane herself came to see them off, which Courtney suspected was less courtesy and more a desire to personally witness the gateway open and close without incident. "Give my regards to Moiraine," Cadsuane said, "and tell her I expect a full account, not the abbreviated version she's fond of giving me." "I'll pass that along word for word," Courtney said. A pair of sisters stepped forward, wove together, and the air folded open onto a familiar view, the wide, sunlit avenues of Camelin, where palace spires rose in the distance, and a gateway landing pad Courtney remembered rather fondly present from her last visit. "After you," Constantine said, gesturing toward the opening with the same lazy flourish he'd used back in Pat's garage, as though international or interdimensional travel were the most ordinary thing in the world to him by now. Courtney stepped through first. Cosmo held loose and easy at her side, already scanning the familiar skyline for a glimpse of anyone she recognized. Stripe followed with the heavy sounds of his footsteps, landing step by step on pavement. And finally, Constantine's unhurried footsteps following close behind her as the gateway sealed shut with a soft, final hush. Chapter 7. Old Friends, New Faces. The gateway to Camelin opened onto a landing platform ringed with palace guards, and this time there was no drawn steel, no wary hesitation as the moment Courtney stepped through. A ripple of recognition passed through the assembled soldiers, murmurs of the star, and it's her rustling down the line before she'd even finished crossing the threshold. Stripe's arrival a moment later drew a rather different reaction. Several guards took an involuntary step back as the massive suit's plated bulk emerged fully from the light, and Constantine's appearance behind him, cigarette-lit, coat trailing smoke, entirely unbothered by the armed men, reassessing him with open suspicion, didn't do much to ease the tension. "Word travels fast around here," Courtney murmured, watching a runner already sprinting off toward the palace proper. "Suppose that's the benefit of being memorable," Constantine said. "Though I notice you got the warm welcome, and I got the look people usually save for something they've stepped in. You get used to it." And she lightly laughed. "And I also suspect you're used to it." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the doors leading toward the royal wing burst open, and Elaine came through them at something rather less than a queenly pace. Skirts gathered in one hand, Rand and Avienda close behind her. Whatever formality the moment might have called for lasted exactly as long as it took Elaine to cross the platform. She threw both arms around Courtney in a hug that nearly knocked the staff from her grip, laughing into her shoulder in a way that had nothing regal about it at all. "You came back," Elaine said, pulling back just far enough to look at her properly. "You actually came back. I told you I would, if you ever needed me." Rand's smile when Courtney turned to him was quieter but no less genuine. The particular smile she remembered from him, tired around the edges but real underneath it. "Good to see you, Courtney." His gaze shifted past her, taking in Stripe's towering form and Constantine's distinctly unimpressed expression with open curiosity. "And I take it, these are the guests you mentioned when word was sent from Tar Valon." "Right." Courtney gestured first to Pat, who was already working the release mechanisms on Stripe's chest plate. "This is my stepfather, Pat Dugan, and that," she nodded up at the suit as it hissed open, Pat climbing free of it with the practiced ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, "is Stripe. Pat built it. It's not magic, it's well. The short version is my dad is a mechanical genius." Avienda circled the suit slowly, studying its plating with the focused, assessing look Courtney remembered her giving most things that could conceivably be dangerous. "It moves like a man wears armor," she said, "but there is no man inside it now, and it still stands." "It's meant to have someone inside," Pat said, wiping his hands on his coat. "Though it can operate on its own for short stretches, if it has to burst something we call remote control." Pat raised a hand and put on a big smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you all properly, as Courtney's told me plenty. And this," Courtney continued, gesturing to Constantine, "is John Constantine. He's one of the most capable magicians in my world, and if anyone back home was going to make sense of what's happening, it was going to be him." Constantine offered a slight, ironic bow that fooled absolutely no one into thinking he took the gesture seriously. "Charmed all around, and a lovely city. This, perhaps a bit short on decent pubs from first glance, but I'm told first impressions can be misleading." Elaine's eyebrow rose, clearly deciding within the span of one sentence exactly how much patience this particular guest was going to require. "Come in, all of you. We'll do proper introductions somewhere that isn't a landing platform." She glanced toward one of the hovering servants. "Send word to Myrain Sadai and Tom Merrilin and ask if they're able to join us in my parlor. Tell them it concerns the matter Myrain came to discuss." Elaine's parlor was much warmer than Cadswain's study had been in every sense. Sunlight through tall windows, the low murmur of a household going about its business somewhere beyond the walls, and refreshments already being laid out by the time Myrain and Tom arrived together. Introductions went around the room, and Courtney watched with quiet interest as Myraine's attention settled on Constantine and did not leave him again. "John Constantine," Moiraine repeated, testing the name like she was weighing it. "I understand you deal in matters that cross between worlds when the mood takes me."
"Yeah."
Constantine dropped into a chair with the same unhurried disregard for propriety he'd shown everywhere else. "And I understand you've been digging through old tower records looking for precedent on something you don't have a name for yet. Funny thing that neither do I. Then perhaps between the two of us we might arrive at one." Myraine's expression hadn't changed, but something behind her eyes had sharpened considerably. "Tell me, in your experience, when the fabric between worlds is disturbed, does it heal cleanly? Or does it scar? Depends entirely on what disturbed it, and how patient the thing doing the disturbing is willing to be." Constantine met her gaze without flinching, which Courtney suspected was already earning him some measure of grudging respect. "In my experience, love, most things that go looking for a wound in reality aren't looking to heal it. A charming philosophy. Never claimed to be charming, just accurate." Tom, watching the exchange with the faint, delighted attentiveness of a man recognizing good material when he saw it, leaned toward Elaine and murmured something that made her hide a smile behind her cup. Courtney took the opening to lay out the situation properly. The shards, the anomalies Constantine had traced across their world. The sigil Papa Midnight had turned up. Chantinelle's warning about a wound propped open. Gabriel's confirmation that whatever was responsible hadn't started its work on Earth at all. "We know a lot about the what," she finished. "We still don't have a who or a why. That's what we're hoping to work out together." Constantine picked up from there, quick and economical. "The short of it, and I'd wager you already suspect this much yourselves, is that whatever's doing this found its opening the moment your dragon here sealed the Dark One away. That kind of power, moving all at once while reshaping a piece of reality to make room for a sealing that size, that doesn't happen quietly. It leaves a mark, and something's been exploiting that mark ever since." Rand went very still at that. The particular stillness Courtney remembered from the nursery days before, the look of a man arriving at a thought he didn't especially want to have. It was Tom who spoke first, though, setting down his cup with the deliberate care of a man about to say something he'd already turned over several times. "If I may, and forgive an old gleeman for thinking in terms of story rather than sorcery. But this raises a rather practical question before we go any further. Travel between worlds is a fine and dramatic notion, but how different precisely is your world from ours?" He looked directly at Constantine, then at Pat, then let his gaze settle, shrewdly, on the metal suit still visible through the parlor windows out in the courtyard. "Because, unless I'm very much mistaken, what you've brought through that gateway isn't sorcery at all, it's craft machinery. And that suggests a world built on rather different foundations than ours. One where your kind of power, Master Constantine, isn't the primary tool at all, but something practiced at the margins." Elaine, Rand, and Avienda all turned toward Pat and Constantine with open curiosity at that. Clearly a distinction none of them had thought to draw so precisely before. "He's not wrong," Pat said. "Where I'm from, the world runs mostly on what we'd call science, physics, chemistry, engineering, and machines. Most people go their whole lives without ever encountering real magic firsthand, because for most of them it doesn't touch their daily life at all. It's not that it isn't real, it's that it's rare and dangerous enough that the people who practice it seriously tend to stay out of the public eye one way or another. A shadow craft," Moiraine said, "practiced by the few in a world governed by something else entirely." "That's about the shape of it, yeah?" Constantine said. "I knew a man once," Pat continued, a faint, wry smile crossing his face. "Colleague of mine, in fact, years back, that kept a genie in a pen, if you can believe that. A little brass fountain pen, and inside it was this small, blue, thoroughly unpredictable creature who granted wishes if you knew the right word to say. Problem was, the genie took everything you said entirely, literally. Ask him for something even slightly imprecise, and you'd get exactly what you asked for and never what you meant. My friend spent half his career cleaning up messes that pen had caused, and the other half swearing he'd never use it again, right up until the next time he absolutely had to. He shook his head, half fond, half exasperated at the memory. That's magic in my world in a nutshell. Powerful, real, and about as reliable as asking a toddler to keep a secret. Avienda's brow furrowed with genuine fascination. A being bound inside so small a vessel that it must be spoken to with such precision. That's about the size of it. I begin to see why you keep it in the shadows, as you say, Moiraine said. Something almost like dry amusement in her voice now. A power that punishes imprecision does not sound suited to a world that runs on contracts and courts. You'd be amazed how much of my job is just being very careful with words, Constantine said. Remind me one day to tell you how I have kept my soul by selling it off to 3 different demons, each with perfect claims on it so that none of them can legally take it. The silence was so great you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. That silence was broken by a servant appearing in the parlor doorway before the conversation could wander much further, bowing briefly toward Elaine. Majesty, word has arrived from Ebo Dar. Lord Mat Cawthon has agreed to come and will arrive by a gateway shortly. Elaine's eyebrows rose. That was fast, especially considering he needs Forona's permission. He does have a certain talent for turning up exactly when he's needed, Moiraine said, usually accompanied by some catastrophe. He insists wasn't his fault. Courtney exchanged a glance with Rand, something settling into place now that the pieces were finally within reach. So, who actually goes? She asked. There was a brief, considering pause around the room before Rand spoke. I think it has to be me, he said. If this began with what I did at Sheol Ghul, then I owe it to whoever's paying the price for that, to help set it right. He glanced toward Elaine, something unspoken passing between them, worry. Trust, and the particular exhaustion of 2 people who'd learned to share both. Mat, if he's willing, for reasons that need no explaining to anyone who's fought beside him. And Moiraine. I had already assumed as much, Moiraine said before he could finish. I did not travel to Caemlyn merely to admire the gardens, and I, Tom added, with the satisfied air of a man who had been waiting the entire conversation for precisely this moment. I'm not about to let my wife wander off into another world without me, especially when there is clearly a story unfolding that I intend to be present for from the very beginning. Moiraine gave him a look that carried the particular fondness of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by him and had never once minded it. Elaine let out a slow breath, glancing toward Avienda and then back at Rand. Then, it's settled, the 4 of you. She reached out and took Rand's hand, brief but firm. Come back to me, all of you. That's the only thing I'm asking. That seems to be everyone's condition lately, Courtney said, thinking of her mother's words in a kitchen that felt, just now, very far away indeed. Wise conditions tend to repeat themselves, Moiraine said, rising smoothly from her chair, already turning her mind visibly toward the practicalities of departure. Now tell me more of this gateway your staff commands, Courtney. If we are to travel by means neither Aes Sedai nor Asherman have ever woven, I would very much like to understand it before I step through it. Chapter 8. Crossing over, Mat Cawthon came through the Caemlyn gateway at something closer to a saunter than a march, his hat tilted at an angle that suggested he'd had every intention of making an entrance, and grinning like a man who'd gotten away with something he fully intended to keep getting away with. Well, Rand said, arms crossed, the ghost of a real smile finally breaking through the weariness he'd been carrying all morning. That was fast, even for you.
Fortuana practically shoved me through the nearest gateway herself. Mat swept off his hat in an exaggerated bow toward no one in particular.
Didn't even let me finish my sentence. I said, Your Imperial Majesty, if it isn't too much trouble, and she cut me right off. Go, she says, now, before I change my mind and decide I need you here instead. That doesn't sound like her, Elaine said, one eyebrow raised. That's what I thought too, but no, dead serious. The second I said it was Courtney asking, he spread his hands. Gone, practically had my bags packed for me. She thinks she owes Courtney a debt she'll never actually admit to owing, Avienda said, matter of fact as ever. It would not surprise me if she'd have crossed the ocean herself, had you asked her instead of Matt. Speaking of apron strings, Elaine said, with the particular dry delight of someone who'd been waiting for an opening, I notice it took exactly one mention of Courtney's name for you to come running too, Matt. Very loyal of you. I resent the implication that I run anywhere for anyone. Matt settled his hat back onto his head with great dignity. I stroll. Purposefully, you strolled into a gateway faster than I've ever seen you stroll onto a battlefield, Avienda said, and Rand actually laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind Courtney hadn't heard from him nearly enough since she'd arrived. Introductions went quickly from there, Matt sizing up Pat and Stripe with open, delighted curiosity, offering Constantine an assessing look that lasted exactly as long as it took the two of them to recognize something familiar in each other. You're the one who's been off calling in favors from demons, Matt said. Heard about that. Sounds like my kind of work, minus the demons, mostly minus the demons. And you're the one who treats luck like a coin in your pocket that you can spend any time it's convenient, Constantine said. I like you already. So tell me, Matt leaned in, the particular gleam in his eye that Courtney suspected meant trouble was already being planned several steps ahead of the conversation. Your world, any good taverns, anywhere a man can find a decent game of dice without somebody accusing him of cheating within the hour, depends entirely on how good you actually are at cheating. Extremely. Then we'll get along fine. Constantine's grin was, for once, entirely without irony. If the two of you are quite finished, Rand said, though he was smiling as he said it, we do actually have somewhere to be. The platform buzzed with quiet, controlled activity as the party assembled with Rand at the center of it. Closing his eyes for a moment the way he had the very first time he'd done this, he drew on the same deep, careful thread of power he remembered from opening the way to Courtney's world months before. Cosmo rested easy in Courtney's grip, and she felt it respond the instant Rand's weave took shape. Not resisting, not straining, simply aligning. The way two hands might finally clasp after reaching for each other across a gap. Same as before, Rand murmured, mostly to himself. It remembers the way light split the air, wider and steadier than any ordinary gateway, and beyond it faint at first, then sharpening into focus. The cluttered, familiar shape of Pat's garage emerged. Mike had been slumped over the desk for the better part of an hour, his chin propped on one hand, fighting a losing battle against sleep, when the world in front of him tore itself open with a sound like a held breath finally released. He was on his feet before he'd fully processed what had woken him up, with his heart hammering as he stared at a widening ring of light exactly where Constantine's chalk glyph had been. And then just as quickly, people were stepping through it, one after another, and Mike's brain did a full, undignified stumble trying to catch up. Dad.
Courtney!
He was across the garage before he'd consciously decided to move. You're back. Wait, how long were you even gone? It's only been like 2 hours. Did it even matter this time? A couple days for us, Courtney said, laughing as he nearly knocked her over with the force of his relief. Mike's attention snapped, almost comically fast, to the four strangers now taking in the garage with expressions ranging from Moiraine's sharp, cataloguing scrutiny to Tom's open delight at the sheer quantity of strange machinery on display. This is where you live, Matt said, turning a slow circle, taking in the tool racks, the half-disassembled engine on a lift in the corner, the fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead. Doesn't look like much. No offense. None taken, but this is only a workshop and not where we actually live. Pat said dryly, already moving to check on Stripe's systems out of long habit. It's incredible, Tom said, running a hand almost reverent along the edge of a workbench. The precision of it, everything built to serve a purpose, nothing left to chance. He glanced toward Moiraine. Rather reminds me of a well-run tower archive, in its way. High praise from you, Moiraine said. Mike, meanwhile, had zeroed in on Rand with the single-minded focus of a teenager who had clearly been rehearsing this moment in his head since the moment Courtney first told him the story. Dude, you actually fought like the literal source of all evil, one-on-one. And you won. That is so unbelievably metal, I can't even... He was already dragging Rand toward the desk, gesturing at the monitor still glowing from whatever he'd abandoned mid-session. Okay, you have got to see this. It's not even close to what you actually did, but it's kind of similar. Like, look. He pulled up a game, his latest MMORPG, showing a sprawling fantasy map dotted with quest markers, and began narrating with breathless enthusiasm, clicking through menus, showing off some hard-won piece of virtual armor with the pride of a man displaying an actual trophy. Rand watched, politely bewildered, and clearly trying and failing to connect any of it to his own experience of the word war. All right. Pat set a hand gently on Mike's shoulder before the boy could launch into a full explanation of the game's crafting system. Everyone's had a very long day, several long days for that matter, depending how you're counting, and I think introductions and virtual dragons can wait until after we've gotten people fed and settled. We'll want to swing by Goodwill too, and get everyone something that won't draw stares walking around Blue Valley. Cloaks and swords are a bit conspicuous around here. A fair point, Moiraine said, glancing down at her own traveling clothes with faint, practical resignation. Constantine, who had been quietly checking something on his phone since the moment he stepped through, straightened and pocketed it. Right? While you do all that, I've got somewhere I need to be. It won't take long. He caught Matt's eye. That drink's still on, mate? Just not yet. Better be soon, Matt said. I've been promised good taverns and I intend to collect. You'll get your taverns. And with that, Constantine was gone, out the garage's side door and into the afternoon light, leaving no further explanation behind him. It took Pat 2 trips in the car to get everyone across town, and by the time the second group pulled into the driveway, Barbara was already standing on the porch, arms crossed, radiating the particular energy of a woman who had spent the last several hours pacing and trying very hard not to. That lasted exactly as long as it took Rand to step out of the car. "Oh," she said, all the nervous tension draining out of her at once, replaced by something warmer and considerably more maternal. "Oh, you must be Rand. Courtney's told me so much about you." She was hugging him before he'd fully processed the introduction, and Rand, visibly startled but also visibly touched, returned it with the slightly stiff politeness of a man unaccustomed to being hugged by strangers, but not remotely opposed to it. "Mistress Dugan," he managed. "Thank you for having us. Barbara, please." She was already moving down the line, taking Moiraine's hand and clasping warmly in both of hers. Tom charmed her by telling a story about his travels within 30 seconds of their meeting. Matt was greeted by her with the particular fondness of a woman who'd clearly already decided, on sight, that he was trouble, and she loved him for it. Courtney watched her mother work the small crowd with something loosening in her own chest that she hadn't quite realized had been wound tight all day. Whatever fear Barbara had carried since that morning at the kitchen table, it was still there, probably somewhere underneath. But watching her fuss over Moiraine's travel-worn cloak and insistence that Tom come sit down before he fell down, it was easy to see something else taking root alongside the fear, comfort, even trust, offered freely to people her daughter had vouched for. "I feel better already," Barbara admitted quietly to Courtney, once the others had been ushered inside. "I don't know why, I can see it looking at them. Whatever you all went through together, it wasn't nothing to them either. They care about you. They really do," Courtney said, and meant it. By evening, the living room had been thoroughly, chaotically transformed into something between a family gathering and a fashion show. Pat and Mike had returned from a combined run to Goodwill and the shops in Blue Valley, bearing bags of jeans, t-shirts, and at Matt's specific, gleeful insistence, the loudest pair of sneakers the store had in stock. Moiraine, now dressed in an unassuming cardigan that somehow still managed to look faintly regal on her, sat with a cup of tea while Tom, resplendent in a loud Hawaiian shirt he had chosen, with obvious gleeful delight over anything more subdued, regaled Barbara with an increasingly embellished account of his famous storytelling. Rand, in a plain button-down that looked almost painfully ordinary on him, sat quietly on the couch beside Courtney, watching the room with the particular contentment of a man who hadn't realized how much he needed an evening this uneventful. Matt, resplendent in his new sneakers, was in the middle of demonstrating to Mike some card trick that was almost certainly a con when the front door opened and Constantine let himself in, exactly as he did everywhere without knocking. Evening, all. He surveyed the room, the tea, the cardigans, the sneakers, all with an expression of profound amusement. "Well, don't you all look thoroughly Earth-appropriate? Where'd you get off to?" Matt asked, not looking up from his cards. "Making arrangements," he said. "Tomorrow we're off to Gotham City to seek the help of the world's greatest detective." Constantine dropped into the one remaining armchair. "Bruce Wayne's agreed to see us. And it happens, he's also got the best equipment on this planet for breaking down exactly the kind of puzzle we're chasing. If there's a pattern in all this that neither Earth nor your world has managed to see on its own, he's about as good a bet as we've got for finding it." Mike, who had been half listening from the kitchen doorway, went wide-eyed and nearly dropped the bag of chips he was holding. "Wait, you're going to go see Batman?" Rand's brow furrowed. Moraine set down her tea with the particular stillness of someone filing away a word for later use. "Batman," she repeated, testing the shape of it like it might mean something entirely different in translation. "Bruce's alter ego," Constantine said, waving a hand like it was barely worth mentioning. "He's a crime fighter that dresses up like a bat and scares criminals witless in a city that's earned every bit of the reputation it's got. You'll see soon enough tomorrow, in fact. Words don't really do the man justice. He dresses as a bat," Tom repeated slowly. "And this is considered an effective method of preventing crime. You'd be amazed." Rand's expression sharpened with interest as Moiraine set down her tea, already visibly cataloguing the name for later. Even Barbara, hovering near the doorway with a fresh pot of coffee, paused to listen. "Right then," said Constantine, as he pushed back up out of the chair with the restless energy of a man who'd been sitting still exactly as long as he could stand, and looked over at Matt with the faint, expectant grin of a promise about to be collected. "Ready for that drink, mate?" Matt was on his feet before the sentence finished, grabbing his hat off the side table with a grin that promised the night ahead was going to be considerably more eventful than card tricks. "Thought you'd never ask." "Behave," Rand called after them, without much real hope that either of them would. "No promises," Matt called back, and the door swung shut behind the two of them, already deep in conversation about exactly which of Blue Valley's establishments might be willing to serve two men from very different worlds a very long night's worth of trouble. Chapter 9. The world's greatest detective. The kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon by the time most of the group started waking up, with Barbara enjoying some moments of solitude with Moiraine, who also sat at the small breakfast table already dressed, with a cup of coffee held in both hands, like she'd been turning it over rather than drinking it. Moiraine's mouth then curved into a smile, faint and genuine. "Your coffee is a marvel, by the way. We have nothing quite like it where I come from. I may need to be talked out of taking some home with me. I'll pack you a bag before you go. Don't you worry." Barbara cracked another egg into the pan, glancing sideways. "Can I ask you something, woman to woman, and not as a queen or lady or whatever title I ought to be using? Moraine will do fine, and of course, dear, ask away, is she going to be all right? Really all right, I mean? Not the version she tells me so I don't worry." Barbara kept her eyes on the pan, like it was easier to ask that way. Moiraine considered the question with real weight before answering. She carries more than most her age ought to carry, and she does it well enough that it is easy to forget she is carrying it at all. Most Aes Sedai in my world are taken to be trained even younger than Courtney, and put through rigors and trials I suspect are equal in many ways to what she has experienced. That is not quite the same as being all right. But she is surrounded now by people who would notice if that changed, and that Barbara is worth more than you might think. Barbara let out a slow breath, something in her shoulders easing at that, and said nothing more, only nodded and turned back to the eggs. Constantine and Matt were, unsurprisingly, the last two down, though only one of them showed any signs of the previous night's activities. "Morning," Constantine said, entirely unbothered, and already reaching for the coffee pot like a man who'd done this exact routine 1,000 mornings before. Matt, by contrast, dropped into a chair with the particular groan of a man whose pride had taken a worse beating than his liver. "Your world," he announced, "has the single most disappointing gambling scene I have encountered in my considerable travels." Oh, Courtney, already at the table with her own plate, raised an eyebrow. "What do you two even get up to?" "John tried to teach me this game, billiards he called it. Sticks, balls, a table with holes in it sounded simple." Matt pointed an accusing finger across the table. "And I am extremely good at games of skill. Extraordinarily good, in fact. Sunned I lost every single time." "He really did," Constantine said, sipping his coffee with visible satisfaction. "It was impressive, actually. Never saw a man lose with such consistency." "That's the part that's bothering me." Matt rubbed at his temple. "I started to wonder somewhere around the fourth game whether my luck simply didn't come here with me, like it stayed behind at the gateway, waiting for me to come collect it." He said it half as a joke, but something in his voice didn't quite land as one. The table went quiet for a moment, with Rand setting down his fork. "That's actually worth testing," Rand said slowly. He closed his eyes, reaching, the way he'd reached 1,000 times before, for the familiar, ever-present thread of Sedin, and found, as he'd half expected, nothing where something should have been. No warmth, no raging fire, no sense of the source waiting to be seized. There was just an absence, the feeling of something missing. Moraine tried as well, more calmly, but just as deliberately, reaching for Sedar with the practiced ease of a lifetime's habit, and found the same emptiness waiting for her. "Severed," she said, setting down her own cup with careful precision, betraying nothing beyond the words themselves. "It feels as though the power itself does not exist in this place at all." "I feared as much," Rand said quietly as he tried once more. Not for Seding exactly, but for the deeper, stranger sense of the pattern itself, the reality-bending awareness he'd carried since the last battle, and found, to his surprise, the faintest thread of something responding. Not Sedin, not quite anything he had a name for. He felt as pressure, distant and unfamiliar, like reaching for a well-worn tool and finding it reshaped into something similar but not quite right in his hand. There's something, it's not the same, something fainter and strange, like it doesn't fit this place the way it fits ours. I don't think I could do much with it. Not safely, and not without getting a full understanding of it first." "Curious," Moiraine murmured, already filing the observation away behind careful eyes. "Don't fret over it too much," Constantine said, buttering a piece of toast with the breezy unconcern of a man who dealt in things far stranger than severed magic on a regular basis. "We're not expecting you lot to be here long enough for it to matter much either way. In and out. Gather what we need, back home before you've had time to miss it properly. Besides, from what I've heard of your source, it is bound to your planet, your realm. Much of what I and others do is a combination of inherent magic here on Earth, as well as energies found in different dimensions." Matt, only slightly mollified, stabbed at his eggs. Still would have liked to win at least once. By the time breakfast had been cleared, everyone but Barbara and Mike had assembled in Pat's garage. Mike, of course, insisted on a full account of the Batcave the moment anyone returned from both Courtney and Pat. Upon arriving, they found Constantine had already begun sketching the second glyph of the trip directly onto the concrete floor. "Bats gave me a fixed point to send us to," he said, working quickly, chalk scratching against stone, "and definitely saves us the trouble of finding our own way in blind." The portal, when it split open, revealed nothing so mundane as green hills or a suburban street. Instead, it opened into a vast, cavernous darkness stretched out before them, lit by the cold blue glow of enormous banked computer screens with distant water dripping somewhere far off in echoing stone. There was, of course, multitudes of silent shapes clinging to the ceiling, which made referring to this as the Bat Cave quite appropriate. In addition, and logically making no sense on first glance, an enormous mechanical dinosaur stood like a trophy over in a corner, along with towering glass cases on an upper level which held what looked distressingly like tattered costumes. And mixed throughout were rows of vehicles sleeker and stranger than anything Pat had ever built. Tom actually stopped mid-step, mouth slightly open. "By the light." "Told you words wouldn't do it justice," Constantine said, clearly enjoying himself. Rand's eyes swept the cavern with the same careful, assessing focus he gave any unfamiliar battlefield, while Matt let out a low, appreciative whistle. Now this is a proper hideout. At the center of it all, a figure sat before the largest of the glowing screens, his cape pooled dark around the chair, cowl pulled back to reveal a face set in the particular stillness of a man perpetually 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation he was about to have. He turned as the group approached, dark eyes moving across each of them in turn with the swift, cataloging precision of someone already building a file. "Constantine," Bruce said, by way of greeting, in a voice that gave away exactly nothing. "You brought quite a group. Told you I would, Batsy." Then, looking at the assembly, began some introductions. "Bruce, you already know Courtney and her father Pat, of course, but the strangers to our world are Rand Althor, Moiraine Sedai, Matt Corton, and Tom Merrilin." Constantine's gaze then drifted toward the far side of the cave, where the movements of a second figure who'd stepped forward to meet them attracted his attention. Tall, green-skinned, unmistakably alien, and entirely unbothered by the reactions he provoked, the Martian manhunter joined them in the console. "And this is Yon Jons, the last of his race and one of the last beings from the planet Mars," Bruce said, by way of introduction, already turning back to the terminal. "Let's not waste time. Sit." Following Batman's curt dismissal, John Jones moved among the rest of the group with an ease that suggested he'd done this exact kind of introduction more than a few times before, though rarely perhaps for guests quite this unusual. "You are wondering, I imagine, what I am," he said, to Pat, Matt, and Tom, who had drifted closer together, watching him with the particular fascination of people who had genuinely never encountered anything like him before. "The thought had crossed my mind," Tom admitted. "Forgive me if the question is impolite where you're from. It is not impolite. It is simply rare for me to be asked without fear attached to it." Something in John's expression softened, ancient, and a little weary. "I am a Martian, green Martian, to be precise. There are others of my world's blood, such as the White Martians, though our two peoples were never kind to one another, and I have not called either kind of Martian family in a very long time. My world is gone, destroyed long ago by a plague I could do nothing to stop. As far as I know, I am the last of my kind left walking." Matt, for once entirely without a joke ready, looked genuinely struck by that. "The last," he repeated quietly. I'm sorry. That's a hard thing to carry." "It is," John agreed simply. "I have found over time that it grows no lighter, only more familiar." He looked between them, something almost curious in his gaze now. "You four carry your own displacement, I think, however differently shaped. An entire world you did not choose to leave, however briefly, however willingly. I find I understand that better than most beings on this planet do." Pat, quiet until now, nodded slowly. "I think that's about the truest thing anyone said to us since we got here." Back at the terminal, Bruce Wayne listened without interruption as Constantine laid out the full shape of the investigation. The anomalies, the sigil, Chantinel's seam marker, Gabriel's warning, the wound left behind by a ceiling of enormous scale in a reality not his own. Batman's fingers moved across the keyboard the entire time, cross-referencing, cataloging, with the Bat-computer's vast screens filling with data faster than Courtney could fully track. "And the shards themselves," Bruce said, once Constantine had finished. "You have samples." Rand reached into a leather pouch at his belt and produced two of the dark, faintly wrong fragments, setting them carefully on the console. We've had these since shortly after the war ended. Aes Sedai in my world have studied them extensively. But hey, resist every form of the power we've tried against them. Bruce picked one up and turned it once beneath the light, then set it into a small scanning tray built into the console without a word of visible surprise at its strangeness. The mark Courtney suspected of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. The machine hummed, light sweeping across the fragment's surface, data scrolling rapidly across the nearest screen. Running full analysis, Bruce said. Molecular structure, energy signature, cross-referencing against everything in the database, and there's quite a lot in the database. He glanced up briefly toward Moiraine. You said your side found no lasting consequence from these anomalies in the deep past. I'd like your tower's full records translated, if that's possible. Even if you only have partial ones. I can have them sent with Courtney or John when we return, Moiraine said. It will take some doing given the medium. We'll manage. The screen continued cycling through data, lines of analysis, stacking faster and faster, and then without warning. The cave itself seemed to catch its breath as the ambient hum of the machinery briefly was drowned out by something else entirely. A sudden, blinding flash of light split the darkness near the center of the cave, and every head turned at once towards it. Chapter 10. The Name of the Dark. When the light finally cleared and eyes adjusted to the cave's dimness once more, the preeminent wielder of magic on all of Earth stood before them. Dr. Fate, the avatar of Nabu, Lord of Order. A cosmic presence that rivaled nearly any being in the universe stood motionless amid the banked glow of the Bat computer's screens, his golden helm catching the light like something that had never once needed it to see by. He said nothing. He didn't need to. A single sweeping glance across the cavern seemed to take in everything at once, the assembled group, the shards resting in their scanning tray, the very shape of the moment itself before that gaze settled and held. Constantine, of course, was the first to break the silence. Well, Fate, good to see you again, mate. He didn't bother rising from where he'd been leaning against the console. Things must be properly bollocksed if you're bothering to show your face. If Fate found any humor in that, none of it reached his voice. Things, he said, in a tone like distant thunder rolling somewhere far below the earth, are considerably worse than bollocksed John Constantine. Rand had gone very still, one hand instinctively drifting toward his side, though no sword hung there anymore. Moraine's breath caught, soft and involuntary, her eyes wide with something Courtney had never once seen on her face before, genuine, unguarded awe. Who, Moiraine whispered, to no one in particular is this being? Pat, by contrast, looked merely impressed rather than stunned. His look was that of a man revisiting an old familiar acquaintance rather than encountering something entirely new. I met him a handful of times, he murmured to Courtney. Back in my Justice Society days. Man doesn't get any less unsettling, with familiarity for the record. That's putting it mildly, Constantine said. And then, louder, addressing the room at large with the air of a man delivering a briefing he'd given 100 times before. For those who haven't had the pleasure, that's Dr. Fate you're looking at. Or rather, that's the vessel. Nabu himself is the one actually driving an old Lord of Order, predates most things you'd care to name, and about as close to a walking law of the universe as anything short of a god gets to be. When fate turns up uninvited, it generally means the universe itself has taken notice of something, not the sort of attention you want. Batman rose from his chair, his cape settling behind him, and faced the newcomer directly. Why are you here? I foresaw this moment, Fate said, and waited until they had crossed into this realm to make my presence known. His gaze shifted, deliberate and unhurried, until it fixed directly on Rand. Your sacrifice in containing the evil of your world unleashed a power so vast it shook the very pattern that governs your reality, and in that shaking it tore open a small breach, a wound through which an outside influence found purchase. The cave had gone utterly silent. Even the bat computer's soft hum seemed to fade beneath the weight of what was coming. That being, Fate continued, is like my master Nabu, a thing that exists beyond time and space as you understand them, a cosmic entity that has afflicted countless worlds before yours, including this one, and now it has reached into yours as well. He paused, and when he spoke again, his eyes burned gold, bright and terrible, cutting through the cave's shadows like twin points of judgment. His name is Eclipso. The name landed in the room, and for a long moment meant nothing at all to most of the people standing in it. Rand's brow furrowed, searching for context that wasn't there. Moiraine's expression remained carefully composed, filing the word away without visible reaction. Matt glanced sideways at Tom, clearly hoping someone else in the room understood what had just happened. Only two faces actually changed. Constantine's jaw tightened as some private suspicion of his own apparently confirmed, and Pat let out a long, exhausted breath, the particular sigh of a man who'd hoped never to hear that name again. When I was with the Justice Society, Pat said, into the waiting silence, years back, the whole team knew that name. Eclipso nearly claimed dominion over this entire planet once. He would have, if greater powers hadn't stepped in and sealed him away. Into a black diamond, if I remember the old briefings right. We all hoped that was the last anyone would ever have to deal with. Him. Apparently not, Constantine said quietly. Batman was already moving, dropping back into his chair, fingers flying across the keyboard with the same clipped efficiency he'd shown all morning. Screens flared to life around him, cascading data and old case files pulled from the depths of a database that clearly held records on threats most of the world had never heard of, let alone forgotten. Here. He turned one of the screens outward so the rest of the group could see Eclipso. First documented centuries ago, though the file suggests his true origin runs considerably older than that. An entity once bound to serve as an embodiment of divine wrath, long before more familiar spirits of vengeance took up that mantle in his place. Whatever he once was meant to be, he broke from that purpose and turned towards something considerably darker. And for that, he was cast down and bound his essence, sealed within an immense black diamond known, according to the older records, as the Heart of Darkness. Bound where? Rand asked. Isolated, banished for a long while, somewhere no one could easily reach him. Bruce scrolled further. That didn't last, as eventually the diamond was found, and through human greed, ambition, carelessness, or whatever normal human failing, shattered it. It broke it into roughly 1,000 fragments that became scattered across the globe. Each shard carries a splinter of him, enough to corrupt whoever holds one, given the right circumstances. His eyes flicked up briefly toward the group. He's been active on Earth more than once since, contained again, each time, but never permanently. He reached over to the scanning tray and picked up one of the black fragments Rand had brought through from his own world, turning it once between his fingers, studying it with open scrutiny. Shards such as these, he asked, looking toward Fate. No. Fate's answer came immediate and absolute. Those are not fragments of his true prison. They are a simulacrum, an artificial construct shaped by Eclipso himself to mimic the shards of his own shattered essence and tuned instead to function within the particular framework of magic native to that world. His golden gaze flicked toward Moiraine, then Rand. He pours a trace of his own essence into each false shard he creates, and through that trace works his influence wherever they are scattered. A mask built to wear a familiar face, and familiar enough to pass in a world that has never encountered the true article. Moiraine looked from the fragment resting in Bruce's palm back to Fate, something sharp and focused settling into her expression. The look Courtney recognized of a woman finally being handed a piece of a puzzle she'd been chasing for weeks. How do we seal the breach in our world? You must return and find the source yourselves, Fate said. I cannot see precisely where in your reality it lies. My sight reaches far, but it is not without limits, and the pattern of your world resists my gaze in ways this one does not. He raised one hand, and between his fingers light gathered and folded inward on itself, taking shape, a small, ornate compass, its face inscribed with symbols that shifted faintly even as Courtney watched, never quite settling into a form she could read. He held it out, and Myrane stepped forward to take it from him, closing her fingers around it with visible care. "This will guide you to the source," Fate said. "It is attuned to Eclipso's essence, to the particular frequency of his corruption. Follow where it leads, and you will find what you seek." "And once we find it," Myrane asked, "how do we seal it?" But Fate was already dimming, the golden light around him folding inward the same way it had unfolded moments before. His form beginning to blur at the edges, like something the world itself was losing focus on. "That," he said, voice already receding, already halfway to somewhere else entirely, "is a question for when you have found it." And then, in a final flash of light, every bit as sudden and absolute as his arrival, Dr. Fate was gone, leaving the cave, and everyone standing in it, considerably more informed and considerably more afraid than they had been a few minutes before. Chapter 11. A Day in the City. "You should take the day," Bruce said, not looking up from the terminal in the flat. Matter-of-fact tone of a man who rarely offered anything resembling a kindness and seemed faintly uncomfortable when he did. "Constantine and I have a great deal of data to sort through, and none of it requires an audience. There's no reason the rest of you should spend it standing around a cave." Constantine, already elbow-deep in cross-referencing Chantinel's sigil against 3 separate databases, didn't even glance up. "He's right. For once, go see a bit of the world while you're in it. Might be the only chance you get." John stepped forward, unbothered as ever. "I'll take them. Gotham can be educational for the uninitiated. I'll see they come to no harm." Bruce reached into a pocket on his utility belt and, without looking away from the screen, produced a sleek black card, holding it out until John took it. "Don't let Cawthon anywhere near a casino." "No promises," Matt said cheerfully, from somewhere near the back of the group. Courtney ducked into a side chamber long enough to trade her uniform for jean shorts and a t-shirt, and by the time she rejoined the others, John was already leading the group up through the manor's winding stairwells toward the garage levels. A detour that drew almost as much wonder from Rand, Myrane, and especially Tom as the cave itself had. "This house," Tom said, craning his neck at the sheer scale of the place, "could swallow a fair portion of the royal palace and still have room to spare." "Wait until you see what he keeps in the garage," Courtney said. John selected one of Bruce's larger SUVs, sleek, dark, and with more than enough room for the whole party. The group piled in with a mixture of practiced ease and lingering awe, as this was only their second time in an Earth vehicle. And they seemed no less fascinated this time around, listening to the engine turn over with the particular attentiveness of people who still hadn't quite reconciled machine with moves on its own. "It is a marvel," Myrane murmured, "that so ordinary a task as traveling from one place to another requires no channeling at all here. Only a fuel source, metal, and clever design." "Wait until she finds out what a plane is," Courtney said to Matt, who grinned like Christmas had come early. Gotham's commerce district hit Outlanders like a physical weight the moment John parked, and they stepped out onto the sidewalk. Towers of glass and steel rose in every direction, dwarfing anything Camelin or even Tar Valon itself had to offer. And the sheer density of storefronts, glowing signage, and glass windows stacked with goods behind them revealed more merchandise visible in a single block than most Andoran market squares held in a week. It left even Myrane momentarily, uncharacteristically silent. "Wooden stalls," Tom said faintly, staring up at a 5-story department store. "We build wooden stalls in our defense," Matt said. "Our wooden stalls don't try quite this hard to make you feel poor just for looking at them." John led them without any particular itinerary, letting curiosity dictate the route. Not one himself for spending money on unnecessary things, he quickly came to realize that this is exactly why regular people often buy curios each time they go on their own vacations. Tom found the music shop entirely by accident, drawn in by a window display of brass instruments catching the afternoon light, and once inside he was, by his own admission, helpless to resist. He ran his fingers over guitars that were similar, yet very different to the lute he carried as a gleeman, and tested the weight of instruments whose names he didn't know until John steered him gently toward a case of harmonicas. "Try this," John said, and Tom, skeptical, brought it to his lips and coaxed out a rough, wavering note that made his whole face light up like a boy's. "Small and portable," he said, turning it over in his hands with something close to reverence. "Simple, yet the range of notes it has." He glanced at John. "I don't suppose." "Already handled," John said, and the shopkeeper rang it up before Tom had finished the sentence. From there it was on to a leather goods store several blocks down. Moran was taken by quality of the high-end luggage and found herself drawn to a travel case expertly stitched and with a clever folding design that could be adjusted to strap securely to a saddle. "Now that," she said, running a thumb along the stitching, "is craftsmanship I have rarely seen in my world." "Sold," John said, already handing the card across the counter. And despite Myraine's protest, John assured her that it was Bruce's intention for everyone to experience, as well as take home some memento from this world. Rand proved a rather more difficult case. He wandered the shops beside the others with polite interest, but nothing seemed to catch his eye, and it was Courtney realized while watching him, not for lack of trying. It was simply that a man capable of reshaping reality itself found little practical use in most of what a store could offer him. What could a shop sell a man who, in his own world, needed only to want something enough to make it so? John, walking a half-step behind him, said nothing about it directly, only tilting his head slightly, with the faint, distant expression of a man listening to something no one else could hear. "You're fond of dragons," he said eventually, mild as anything. Rand startled, glancing sideways. "Aye." He hesitated, some old wound flickering briefly behind his eyes at the word itself, the title he'd carried, and the cost of carrying it. "I suppose I am, though not in the way you likely mean." "I mean simply the creature," John said, "not the burden the word carries for you." He was already angling them toward a quieter street, on the edge of the district where lantern-strung awnings and red-painted storefronts marked the beginning of Gotham's Chinatown. In a small, crowded shop, tucked between a tea-house and a tailor, they found it a small dragon figure, carved and gilded, scales inlaid with dozens of tiny, faceted jewels that caught the light in 100 shifting colors as Rand turned it slowly in his hands. "It's beautiful," he said, quiet, and genuinely surprised by his own reaction. I wasn't looking for anything like this." "Sometimes the best gifts aren't things you go looking for," John said, and set the card down on the counter before Rand could protest. Matt predictably found his own prize in a bookshop, a heavy, well-worn volume titled simply The Art of War. Its spine cracked from what looked like centuries of hands turning its pages. He read the back cover twice, then flipped it open at random, and stood there long enough that Courtney had to physically nudge him to keep the group moving. "This man," Matt said, tapping the cover with something like reverent disbelief, "understood everything. Deception, timing, knowing when not to fight at all. This is either going to be the best thing I've ever read, or I'm going to be insufferably smug about already knowing half of it, given your track record." Moraine said, "I suspect both." The game store nearly cost them the rest of the afternoon. Matt stopped dead in the doorway the moment he spotted the wall of boxed games spread all throughout the store, and within minutes he had commandeered an entire display table, turning over box after box with the single-minded focus of a man who had just discovered an entire undiscovered country of things to gamble on. "What in the light is this?" Picking up a chessboard and running his thumb over one of the carved pieces. "We've nothing like this. We've got a game on a board like this called Stones, All Territory and Patience. But this, 2 armies, actual ranks, a king you have to actually corner." He set it down with visible reluctance, only to immediately pick it back up. Fortuona would either love this or declare it treason for daring to put an empress on the board below a king. Get it for her, Courtney said. Either reaction sounds like it'd be worth it. Matt grinned and looked over at John, who simply replied with a knowing smile and once again the flash of Bruce's credit card. He moved next to a rack of playing cards, sorting through decks with growing bewilderment. 52, he muttered, counting under his breath. And this one's got 53. Why's there an extra? The standard playing card deck mirrors historical events and certainties of this world, John said, mild as ever. 52 cards represent the 52 weeks in a year, the 4 suits for the seasons. 13 cards, a suit for the lunar cycles within each. The face cards trace back to medieval court rank, kings, queens, knaves, who eventually became jacks. The extra card is the Joker, which was added later, and it has no fixed rule for him at all, which is rather the point. Matt looked at the deck with an entirely new level of respect. A card that doesn't follow the rules on purpose. He mused. I like this world more by the minute. He grabbed 3 decks, then spotted a felt-lined case of dice near the register. Not the plain cubes he was used to, but a full spread of shapes. 4-sided, 8, 10, 12, and he held the largest one up to the light like it was a religious artifact. One with 20 full sides. 20, he breathed. An honest 20-sided die. He looked at John with something close to genuine emotion. I am buying every one of these. Already assumed as much, John said, and the card was out before Matt had finished loading his arms. Lunch was, by unanimous and largely wordless agreement, exactly the kind of chaos a group this size deserved. Tom and Rand went for a steak, ordered with the particular seriousness of men who took a good meal as seriously as a good story. Pat and Courtney settled for pizza, which Pat and Courtney said is a good choice for any meal. Maureen, intrigued by the description alone, ordered something called a Cobb salad and picked through it with the careful, deliberate curiosity of a woman cataloguing an unfamiliar ingredient list. Matt naturally went all in on a full platter of fajitas, sizzling and enormous, and declared within 2 bites that Earth had, at minimum, gotten something exactly right. John ordered nothing solid himself, content to offer quiet commentary, as plates arrived until the dessert menu came around and something like real enthusiasm broke through his usual composure. Oreo milkshakes, he said, tapping the menu with unmistakable satisfaction. This I fully endorse. You've been unreadable all day, and that's what gets you excited? Matt asked. Priorities, John said, entirely unbothered, and ordered 2. They were nearly back to the SUV when Rand stopped short outside a glassware shop, drawn by something in the window that made him go very still. Inside, lit from below, sat a sculpture, a bull rendered in rich, swirling color, with 3 delicate glass roses arranged around its lowered head. John, Rand said slowly, what is that meant to represent? Bullfighting, John said, a tradition in certain countries here on Earth. It entails a man facing down a bull alone, armed with only a cape and a blade. It's a dangerous and controversial battle even here. But there's a custom that's outlasted the argument over whether it should exist at all, where the crowd throws roses in honor of the bull, regardless of how the contest ends. Rand's expression shifted, something clicking into place behind his eyes. Caimlin's sigil, he murmured, is a white lion, but the roses are also of Andor. He looked back at the sculpture with entirely new intensity. But something else might make this special for Elaine, since a man she grew up around has his house sigil that of a bull and roses, and it will be a nice reminder. Then it settled, John said, and the shop's owner was already wrapping it with great care before Rand had fully finished admiring it. A few shops further, Rand paused again, this time before a display of oils, sponges, and richly scented soaps, all arranged in an ornate gift box that looked, if anything, slightly indulgent even by Earth standards. For Avienda, he said, with the private fond smile of a man thinking of someone very specific. She'd never have touched anything like this a few years back, as the waste doesn't leave much room for indulgence, and she still argues that water shouldn't be wasted on comfort. But she's taken to baths since the war ended more than she'll ever admit to enjoying out loud. I think she'd like this, even if she pretends otherwise for a week before she uses it. A gift for the twins? Courtney asked, glancing at him as they made their way back toward the vehicle, arms now thoroughly laden. Rand smiled, the first fully unguarded smile Courtney had seen from him all day. That one, I think, I'll leave for last. They won't care where it came from, only that it's something to hold on to. By the time John steered the SUV back through Wayne Manor's gates, the afternoon light had gone long and gold across the grounds. It was an exciting day as the whole group was weighed down with bags, boxes, and the particular satisfied exhaustion of a day spent entirely without care. "Bruce is going to see this receipt," John said, almost as an afterthought, pulling the vehicle to a stop, "and I am going to enjoy that conversation a great deal more than he will." Once inside, the lights of the Batcave access point flickered faintly below, a reminder, gentle but unmistakable, that the day's reprieve was drawing to its close, and whatever Bruce and Constantine had spent the afternoon compiling was waiting for them the moment they arrived by elevator. Chapter 12. What the detective found, tired as everyone was from a day spent wandering Gotham's streets. No one so much as suggested postponing the briefing. Bags of souvenirs were set aside in a corner of the cave, although Tom's harmonica was already tucked carefully into his coat. Matt's dice case balanced on top of the pile like a small trophy, and the group settled around the main terminal with the particular alertness of people who understood, without needing to be told, that whatever came next mattered more than being tired. Bruce had not wasted the day, as a thick binder sat waiting on the console, every page inside laminated and carefully ordered. It contained printouts of shard analyses, cross-referenced anomaly reports, Constantine's sigil rendered in painstaking detail alongside notes in a precise, economical hand. It was, Courtney thought, exactly the kind of thing a detective made when he intended for the information to survive, being carried into a world with no printers, no databases, nothing beyond paper and memory. "For Tar Valon," Bruce said, sliding the binder across the console toward Moiraine. "Everything we've confirmed, organized in a form that'll hold up wherever you're taking it. I'd rather your scholars have the full picture than a second-hand account of one." Moiraine took it with visible care, turning through the first few pages with quiet, focused interest. "Thorough," she said, and from her Courtney suspected that single word carried the weight of genuine praise. "Here's the shape of it," Bruce continued, pulling up a final summary on the main screen. "Eclipso isn't trying to fully cross over into your world, not yet. And possibly not at all in the way you might expect an invasion to look. What he's doing instead is subtler and in some ways worse. He's using the artificial shards to seize influence over people who matter, leaders, power brokers, anyone positioned to shape events from the inside without ever needing to show his own hand directly. A slow corruption," Moiraine said slowly, "rather than a swift conquest." "Exactly, which means the fix isn't a battle in the way you're used to fighting one. It's retrieval. Every shard scattered through your world needs to be found and brought to the breach itself, then ejected through it and sent back into whatever void or otherworld space he originates from. Do that and seal the breach behind them, and your world's secure barring another event with enough raw power behind it to tear a new opening. The kind of power," he added, with a glance toward Rand that needed no further elaboration, "that doesn't come along very often." Rand's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing, only nodded for Bruce to continue. Moiraine and Rand pressed a handful of further questions. How many shards precisely might exist? Whether the breach itself could be expected to resist being sealed? What should be done if more than one presented itself at once? And Bruce answered what he could with the same clipped precision he'd shown all day. What he couldn't answer, he said so plainly, without hedging, which Courtney suspected earned him more trust from the pair of them than a confident guess ever would have. Eventually, the questions ran their course, and something like quiet settled over the group. The particular stillness of people who'd been handed everything they were going to get and understood it was at last enough to move on. "One more thing," Bruce said, before anyone could rise. "Stargirl needs to be there when the breach is sealed." Courtney straightened. "Me specifically, Cosmo specifically, though I doubt the staff separates easily from you at this point." Bruce's gaze was level, entirely without drama, which somehow made the statement land harder than if he'd dressed it up. "The staff has opposed Eclipso directly in the past. If he makes any attempt to interfere from the other side while the breach is open, you may be the only meaningful resistance standing between him and whoever's doing the sealing." Pat was on his feet. Before Bruce had finished the sentence, some instinctive protest already forming, and then, visibly, he caught himself jaw working for a moment before he simply nodded instead. "I'm coming too, then," he said. "I promised her mother I'd watch over her every step. That doesn't stop at a breach in another world." "Wouldn't have expected otherwise," Constantine said, already pushing off the console he'd been leaning against. "And I'll be along as well. Whatever's waiting on the other side of that tear isn't the sort of thing your channelers have much practice against. And if it comes to keeping something at bay while the sealing happens, that's rather my area of expertise." Bruce looked around the assembled group once more. Courtney, Pat, Constantine, Rand, Moiraine, Matt, Tom, and something in his expression, if not quite warmth, at least approached respect. "Good luck," he said, and turned back to his terminal, screens already shifting toward whatever the night's patrol required of him. The conversation closed as decisively as it had opened. Constantine herded the group back toward the spot they'd first crossed into the cave, chalk already in hand, when John's voice stopped them.
"Wait."
He crossed to where their bags had been set aside and produced from behind his back, with the faint, private satisfaction of a man who'd planned this moment all day. 2 teddy bears. Plush, soft, entirely unremarkable except for the obvious care with which they'd clearly been chosen. "For your children," John said, holding them out to Rand. "I suspected watching you today that you'd forget them in all the searching for something meaningful, so I took the liberty." Rand stared at the 2 small bears for a long moment before taking them, something raw and unguarded, crossing his face, the same expression Courtney thought that had surfaced over the dragon figurine, except more so. "Jean," he said, and had to stop, clear his throat, start again. "Thank you for this and for all of it today." He looked up, meeting the Martian's steady gaze directly. "I don't think I've enjoyed something as much in 2 years as I did today. I didn't expect that coming here." "Neither did I, if I'm honest." John said, something gentle in his voice. "It was good having you all. Good luck to all of you, and Godspeed wherever that breach takes you." Constantine's glyph took shape quickly. Chalk scraping against stone in the same economical strokes, Courtney had watched him draw twice before now, and the portal split open onto the familiar clutter of Pat's garage. Dim in the evening light, exactly as they'd left it. One by one they stepped through, Rand first, bears tucked carefully beneath one arm, followed by Moiraine with the binder held close. Tom came through next, with Matt still turning a die absently between his fingers, and then Pat, Courtney, and finally Constantine bringing up the rear as the portal sealed shut behind them with its familiar soft, final hush. Ahead of them, through the garage's side door, the streetlights of Blue Valley glowed against the darkening evening, and tomorrow final decisions would be made before returning to the other side. Chapter 13, Homeward Sideways Morning, came quiet and a little heavier than the ones before it. The whole house carrying the particular hush of a departure everyone had known was coming, but nobody was quite ready for. Rand, Matt, Moiraine, and Tom had all changed back into their own clothes, coats and cloaks and boots that looked, after 2 days of denim and sneakers, almost startlingly formal against the Dugan's kitchen, though each of them had packed their borrowed earth clothing carefully away regardless, tucked into bags alongside the rest of their souvenirs. "Never know," Matt said, folding his flannel shirt with more care than Courtney had expected from him. When a man might need to look like he belongs somewhere else entirely, or when we might find reason to return, Moiraine added, setting her own neatly folded bundle atop the binder Bruce had given her. Courtney and Pat stood near the kitchen island, while Mike orbited the group with the restless energy of someone trying to make a goodbye last slightly longer than it needed to. He hugged Courtney twice, then Pat, then, after a moment's visible hesitation, awkwardly offered his hand to Rand, who shook it solemnly, like the gesture deserved every bit as much weight as it had clearly been given. "Watch yourselves over there," Mike said. "All of you. I mean it." "We'll be back before you know it," Courtney said, though even she could hear how much less certain that sounded than she meant it to. Barbara made her way down the line slowly, hugging each of them in turn. Tom first, who accepted it with theatrical grace and murmured something about her hospitality being the finest he'd encountered on either side of the gateway. Then Matt, who she held on to just slightly longer than she probably intended, muttering something that made him grin. Then Rand, gentle and warm, telling him quietly to take care of himself and not just everyone around him, which visibly caught him off guard. "It's been an absolute pleasure having all of you," Barbara said, straightening, eyes a touch bright. "Truly, I don't think this house has ever been this loud or this full. And I didn't realize how much I'd missed that until right now." She turned to Moiraine last. And the hug between them lingered two women who'd spent one quiet morning over coffee, finding more common ground than either had probably expected to. "Oh, wait, before you go." Barbara pulled back suddenly, something clicking into place behind her eyes. "I completely forgot." She disappeared into the living room and returned a minute later carrying a large, glossy hardcover and a smaller paper bag, both of which she pressed into Moiraine's hands. "This," Barbara said, tapping the book's cover, "is a National Geographic visual atlas of the world. Every country, every culture, and every tribe of peoples I could think you might never otherwise hear of. Their politics, religions, all of it, accompanied with pictures so you don't have to imagine any of it secondhand." I thought, given how much you clearly love learning things, you might actually enjoy it rather than just find it useful. Moiraine turned the atlas over in her hands, and something quietly crossed her, usually, composed features. "This is remarkable, and these," Barbara held up the smaller bag, "are coffee cherries. I was able to get you a whole bag of them, fresh from a little shop near here. Plus, I got this book on how to properly grow the trees. I don't know if the climate where you're from would even support it, but I thought, well, if Earth's going to leave you with anything permanent, it might as well be good coffee." Moiraine actually laughed, soft and genuine, an entirely unguarded sound Courtney had rarely heard from her. "These are wondrous gifts, Barbara. Truly." She held the atlas and the bag close, like she meant to keep them exactly that close for the whole journey home. "Perhaps one day I might make the passage back to your world myself properly, with time enough to see some of what this book only shows in pictures. I would be honored to have you as my guide when that day comes." "I'd like that," Barbara said. "I'd like that a great deal." Constantine let himself in without knocking, exactly as always, a cigarette already lit. "Right, everything's set at the garage, so whenever you're all done with the sentiment, we've got a gateway to catch." There were a few final rounds of goodbyes, quick now, brisk, the kind that came easier once the harder ones had already been said, and then the group filed out toward Pat's garage, bags slung over shoulders, the morning sun still low and pale over Blue Valley's quiet streets. "One thing to keep in mind," Constantine said, as they walked. "My glyph only opens where it opened last, the grounds outside Tarvalon. So brace yourselves for round 2 of startled guards, as I hope they'll recover faster this time round." "They'd better," Matt said. "I don't fancy explaining myself to a wall of drawn swords before breakfast has even settled." Pat climbed into stripe along the garage's back wall, plating sealing shut with its familiar heavy click, and Constantine knelt to sketch the glyph one final time. Quicker now, more practiced than it had been that very first morning, his chalk moving in sure, economical lines across the concrete. The portal then split open, gold and steady, and one by one they stepped through it. Rand first, bears and all, followed by Moiraine with her new atlas held carefully against her chest. Tom came next, followed by Pat inside Stripe's heavy tread, and finally Courtney and Constantine together, leaving Blue Valley behind for the second time and stepping once more into the wide, waiting world of the Wheel. Chapter 14. What the Armelin was told, the gateway opened onto the same platform as before, and the same instinctive readiness rippled through the assembled guards. Steel half-drawn, their stances low before recognition caught up with reflex. The moment Rand and Moiraine stepped clear of the light, swords lowered all along the line, and the lead warder waved off the tension with the particular efficiency of a man who'd clearly been briefed to expect exactly this. "Warder," Moiraine said, "please send word to the Armelin if you would. Tell her we've returned and that it's urgent." He was gone before she'd finished speaking. Pat brought Stripe down just outside the platform with a heavy, controlled thud, plating hissing open a moment later as he climbed free, securing the suit with the same practiced efficiency he'd shown at every stop so far. By the time he'd finished, an escort had already arrived to lead them toward the tower, and within minutes they were filing into Cadsuane's study, where the Armelin herself sat waiting, flanked by her keeper, Liane Sharif, and two brown sisters whose expressions suggested they'd been pulled from deep research and were not entirely pleased about the interruption until they saw who'd walked through the door. "Mother," Moiraine said, inclining her head, "we have returned from Courtney's world with information and a most remarkable visitation." Cadsuane, who had lived well over a century and had long since made it a habit of appearing entirely unsurprised by anything, merely folded her hands and waited. Which Moiraine had long since learned was invitation enough. "We spent the better part of 2 days in what could only be described as a cave," Moiraine continued. "A bat cave as its owner, a man named Bruce Wayne, called it. Batman is his alter ego when he isn't running a massive company in downtown Gotham City, and is apparently also a crime fighter with some very eclectic enemies." A faint, dry note entered her voice, as though she still hadn't fully reconciled the absurdity of the title with the gravity of everything else she had to report. "While we were there, a massive being of light manifested in our midst. He came unannounced, and by his own account, deliberately timed. He provided us not only with the identity of whoever has been troubling our world since Rand sealed away the Dark One, but with the clearest guidance yet toward sealing the breach ourselves." Cadsuane's expression didn't shift, though something behind her eyes sharpened considerably. "And who," she said, "was this being of light, and who is the darkness plaguing us?" "The being called himself Dr. Fate," Moiraine said. "An avatar, a vessel as I understood it for a cosmic entity called Nabu, a lord of order older than most reckonings of time. And the darkness he named," she paused briefly, choosing her next words with care, "is called Eclipso. He too is a cosmic entity, mother, older than either of our worlds by Fate's account, and no stranger to Bruce Wayne and Courtney's people either. Interestingly, Pat Dugan here, and a hero of his own generation before him, encountered this same Eclipso decades past in his world." Cadsuane's gaze shifted to Pat. "Then you have something to add, I imagine." "I do." Pat stepped forward, laying out what he knew in the same plain, economical terms he'd used in Bruce's cave Eclipso's origin as a fallen spirit of wrath, his imprisonment within a great black diamond, the diamond's eventual shattering into roughly 1,000 fragments scattered across his own world. Those fragments caused no end of trouble for us over the years, and from what I understand, the shards that have been turning up here, in your Blight, in Sianda, and wherever else, they're not pieces of that same original prison. They're copies, something Eclipso built himself, shaped to work within your world's kind of power instead of ours." Cadsuane was quiet for a long moment. turning that over with visible weight before Moiraine set the binder down on the desk between them. It was thick, laminated, and meticulously organized, and was followed by the small golden compass, its inscribed face still shifting faintly, even at rest. "Everything we learned is recorded here," Moiraine said. "And this," she indicated the compass, "was given to me by Dr. Fate himself. It is attuned to Eclipso's essence, and will guide us to the breach once we're ready to seek it out." Cadsuane studied both objects for a long moment before finally sitting back, some decision visibly settling into place behind her eyes. "This will take time," she said. "My best scholars will need to go through all of it properly, and I expect questions will follow that only the two of you," her gaze moved between Moiraine and Rand, "along with Tom, will be able to answer. You'll remain here until that work is done." She turned next to Constantine, who had been leaning against the doorframe with his usual air of faint, unbothered amusement. "And you, I trust you're willing to stay and assist as well." Constantine exhaled a slow curl of smoke, entirely unbothered by being addressed so directly by the most powerful woman in the tower. "That's rather why I'm here, love." Cadsuane's gaze narrowed fractionally at the address, though she let it pass, turning instead toward Matt, who had been hovering near the back of the room with the studied casualness of a man hoping to avoid being noticed at all. "You, however," she said, "will be returning to Ibu Dar. The Empress made it exceedingly clear you were to come back to her the moment your business here concluded." Matt's grin was immediate and entirely unrepentant. "Was already planning on it, Mother. I wouldn't dream of keeping Fortuona waiting longer than necessary." He hesitated, then added, with rather more sincerity than his usual banter carried, "I'll be back the moment you need me for this, though. Just say the word." Courtney stepped forward before he'd finished. "I'd actually like to come along too, if that's all right. I'd love to see Fortuona again, and if it's not too much trouble, I was hoping Pat could come too." Matt's face lit up considerably at that. "Oh, she'd have my neck if I came home without bringing you by Courtney. Make no mistake." He glanced toward Pat with open delight. "And she'd flay me with a rusty knife if I didn't show her that beast of a robot suit of yours while I had the chance. Come on then, both of you." Cadsuane allowed the faintest trace of something almost like amusement to cross her face. "Very well," she turned to the keeper. "Send word ahead to Ibu Dar that a gateway will be opening for Lord Corthan and his guests." Within minutes, farewells were exchanged, brief, warm, the easy kind that came after so many harder ones already behind them and Matt. Courtney and Pat made their way back toward the platform, leaving the rest of the group behind in Cadsuane's study. Once they'd gone, Moiraine retrieved one final item from her bag, the heavy, glossy atlas Barbara had pressed into her hands that morning, and set it on the desk beside the binder. Cadsuane opened it without comment, and the room went quiet for several long minutes as she turned through the first several pages, followed shortly by Leanne and the two Brown sisters, who abandoned all pretense of composure the instant they saw the maps, the photographs, the tightly organized statistics laid out for every nation and culture the book contained. "Remarkable," one of the Browns murmured almost reverently, tracing a finger along a page dense with charts. "The clarity alone, every nation," the other added, flipping ahead. "Every people's recorded in this much detail and freely printed for anyone to simply own." Rand, watching from across the room, allowed himself a small, tired smile. "If Elaine ever gets her hands on that book," he said, "she's going to get it into her head that Andor needs a proper census. Mark my words." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room at that. Small but genuine, the first real lightness since they'd stepped through the gateway. And for a moment at least, the weight of everything still ahead of them settled just a little easier on everyone's shoulders. Chapter 15. 3 Days in Ibu Dar. The gateway opened within the grounds of the Tarasin Palace itself, secured and shielded from public view as the three of them stepped through into the hushed quiet of a private courtyard. A sharp contrast to what awaited just beyond the gates.
Right?
Matt said, straightening his coat, with the particular resignation of a man about to do something he'd done 100 times and never once enjoyed. This part I do alone. Give me a moment's head start. Trust me on this. He was gone before Courtney could ask why, escorted by a waiting honor guard out through the palace gates and into the wide public courtyard beyond where, even from a distance, the sound of the crowd reached them like a rising tide. Ebo-Dar had turned out in force as word of the Prince of the Ravens' return, having rippled through the city the moment Fortuna's officials confirmed it and spread word through the city. And the cheer that went up as Matt appeared beneath the gate arch was loud enough to rattle the windows behind them. "Now," Pat said, already climbing back into Stripe's plating with a grin Courtney rarely saw on him. "I believe that's our cue." Cosmo hummed to life in Courtney's grip, and together they rose into the pale afternoon sky. Courtney soaring low and bright over the palace walls, while Stripe, a heavier, more thunderous presence just behind her, dropped down into the courtyard in a controlled, deliberate landing a few respectful paces behind Matt, exactly as an honor guard might arrive to flank a returning prince. The crowd's roar redoubled instantly. Ebo-Dar remembered Stargirl, remembered what she had done in Seandar, and remembered exactly what her arrival had meant the last time she'd set foot in this city. And the sight of her descending from the sky alongside a towering suit of gleaming armor sent a fresh wave of noise rolling across the courtyard, banners waving, voices calling her name alongside Matt's. Fortuna received the spectacle from atop the palace steps with the same immaculate, unreadable composure she wore for every public occasion, though Courtney caught the faintest flicker of genuine approval in her eyes before she inclined her head the barest fraction, and the precise degree of acknowledgement an empress permitted herself in front of a crowd. Fortuna then turned to lead the way back inside, the signal for the formal portion of the day to conclude. Only once the doors had closed behind them did Pat finally climb free of Stripe, leaving the suit standing sentinel in the courtyard, powered down into its watchful sentry mode, before following Courtney and Matt into the palace proper. The formality lasted exactly as long as it took to clear the public ceremony, because the moment the doors to Fortuna's private study closed behind them, every trace of imperial reserve dropped away at once. The Empress of the Cien Can crossed the room in a few quick strides to pull Courtney into a hug that was, for a woman raised on protocol, as rigid as scripture, almost startlingly fierce. She followed this by turning immediately to press a long, unhurried kiss to Matt that left him looking, for once in his life, genuinely and thoroughly speechless. "You," Tuon said, pulling back just far enough to look at Courtney properly, "have been gone entirely too long. I and the kingdom have missed you, Stargirl." "I missed you too," Courtney said, and meant it. "It's really good to see you, Tuon." Tuon's attention shifted next to Pat, sharp and immediately curious. "And this is the father you spoke of, the one who builds." "Pat Dugan, your Imperial Majesty," Pat said, with a respectful bow that seemed to satisfy her considerably more than any elaborate formality would have. "I have seen that marvelous weapon you flew in on," Tuon said without preamble. "I desire the opportunity to learn more and to see the inner workings of what you have built." "I can arrange an inspection," Pat said, "and tell you how everything works while we're at it." Matt, ever a man who understood the value of good timing, chose that exact moment to produce the gift he'd carried carefully across 2 worlds. The chessboard, ebony and ivory inlaid with meticulous precision, with the pieces themselves carved with a level of detail that made even Tuon's carefully composed expression flicker with genuine interest. "A game," he said, "from Courtney's world called chess. It's about strategy, deception, patience, and an entire war fought across 64 squares. No blood spilled, of course, unless you count pride." He set the board down with a flourish. Tuon picked up one of the carved pieces, a king, solid and weighty in her palm, as turned it over slowly, studying the craftsmanship with the same intensity she brought to matters of state. "Teach me," she said. It wasn't a request. What followed consumed the better part of the afternoon and well into the evening. Pat was pressed into service as the reluctant instructor, walking both Tuon and Matt through the movement of each piece, the shape of an opening, the slow accumulation of small advantages into an inevitable checkmate. Tuon proved a frighteningly quick study, but of course, so was Matt. After losing her first 3 games to him in rapid succession, she turned the tables entirely on the fourth, much to his very vocal and thoroughly wounded pride. "This," Tuon announced, sometime past midnight, staring down at a board where she had just cornered Matt's king with brutal efficiency, "may be the finest gift outside of when you brought me Akine." "Don't let it go to your head," Matt muttered, though he was smiling as he said it. It was Min Darbinder, now in the formal address of Tuon's service, who found a quiet moment alone with Courtney the following afternoon, drawing her aside onto a balcony overlooking the canals below. "How is he?" Min asked without preamble, the careful formality she wore so well around the court falling away entirely once it was just the two of them. Rand. "How is doing with this new crisis, as I have not seen him in some while?" "Busy," Courtney said honestly. "This whole threat, it's not just Sionkan, it's not just his world at all, it's bigger than that, and he knows it, and I think some part of him almost expected it. Like the universe wasn't quite finished asking things of him, despite all he's done and gone through." She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "But he's doing all right, Min. Tired, but all right. And I think once this is over, once the breach is sealed, and it's actually finished, I think he's going to have a lot more room in his life for visits, for a lot of things, honestly. I don't think the weight's ever fully left him, not since he sealed the Dark One away from what I can tell. But maybe closing this will finally give him some real peace to go along with it." Min was quiet for a moment, looking out over the water, something unguarded and hopeful crossing her face. "I'd like that," she said softly. "For him more than for myself, if I'm being honest. He's earned some peace, I think, more than almost anyone alive."
"He has," Courtney agreed.
"And I think he's a lot closer to finding it than he realizes." The message arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, delivered with the same formal precision as everything else in Tuon's court. Word from Tar Valon that the plans were finalized, and a courteous request that Matt, Stargirl, and Pat return as soon as could be arranged for the work ahead, could wait no longer. Tuon read it once, then a second time, her expression settling into something serious and entirely without the political calculation Courtney had half expected. This, clearly, was not a matter she intended to weigh against house politics or imperial pride. "This concerns more than kingdoms," Tuon said, setting the message down. "More than houses, and even more than my own throne. Whatever came to your world is coming for mine as well. Whether or not it wears the Xianchan banner or something else when it arrives." She looked up, a decision already made. "Go, all of you, and when this is finished, truly finished, I expect a full account." "You'll get it," Courtney promised. Within the hour, Tuon's own reply had gone out. A gateway would open within a few hours' time, and Matt, Courtney, and Pat would be ready to step through it the moment it did, carrying 3 days' worth of chess victories, quiet conversations, and renewed resolve back toward whatever waited for them at Tar Valon. Chapter 16. Before the road, the study was fuller than it had been days before, with Cadsuane at the center of it as always, Leanne at her side. 2 brown sisters flanking a table now spread with maps, and the whole gathered company of Rand, Moiraine, Tom, Matt, Pat, Courtney, and Constantine crowded around it, waiting. "We've narrowed the search, though not without difficulty," one of the Browns said, tracing a finger along the map toward the coast. "Mayane will be first. Rumors have reached us of a sudden rise in unrest, an uprising seemingly from nowhere with no clear cause anyone there can name. Lord Galad and Lady Berelaine have both sent word asking whether the Tower has heard anything that might explain it. We hadn't, until now. And the second," the other Brown continued, moving her finger inland toward the Isle waste, "is Rudian. Our sisters who walk in Teleranriod have been in regular contact with wise ones there, coordinating their rebuilding efforts. In recent weeks, several report a corruption they cannot name or explain, as if something is interfering with their work. It is subtle but persistent, resisting every attempt to identify its source. Moraine's fingers tightened slightly around the golden compass at her belt. Both fit, she said. A place of unrest with no cause, and a place of corruption no one can name. If Eclipso's shards are behind either, I'd wager the compass will confirm it the moment we're close enough to test it. Then that settles the order of things, Cadsuane said. Moraine leads with the compass to guide you. Rand beside her, for reasons none of us need spell out further. Thom, to keep record of what's found a chronicler we know with a good memory for details in whatever direction it takes. And Matt, Pat, and Courtney for protection, in place of warders none of you would have thought to bring. Happy to oblige, Matt said. Though I'll point out I'm considerably better company than most warders I've met. Debatable, Moiraine said, dry as ever, and Matt grinned like he'd won something. A sister appeared in the doorway before the planning could go further, bowing briefly. Mother, Logan Ablar has arrived and requests to see you and your guests at once. Cadsuane's expression didn't shift, though Courtney caught the faint, knowing look that passed between her and Leanne. Send him in. Logain entered a moment later, dark and imposing as Courtney remembered him, his gaze sweeping the room and settling briefly on each face before coming to rest on Cadsuane herself. I understand you've found your breach's source, or near enough to it. I intend to make good on what was agreed upon months ago that the Black Tower stands with the White Tower on this. I'd like to send 2 Asherman with your company. I gave my word to keep the Black Tower informed, Cadsuane said, and I meant it. If you have men suited to the task, I've no objection. I do. Logain's mouth twitched, something almost approving in it. Jur Grady and Fedwin Moore. They are both steady, experienced, and both are entirely capable of holding their own if this turns into more than a search. Moiraine inclined her head. We'd be glad of the extra hands and the extra strength if it comes to it. Then it settled. Logain's gaze moved once more around the room, lingering briefly on Rand. Good hunting, Sull of you. And with that, as abruptly as he'd arrived, he took his leave, presumably to collect the 2 men in question. Before we begin properly, Rand said, once the room had settled again, I'd like to stop in Camelin first. I want to see Elaine, Avienda, and the twins before I go. He glanced at Cadsuane, not quite asking permission, but offering her the courtesy of the request all the same. A day will do, and we'll be on our way to Mayenne shortly after. I have no objection, Cadsuane said. Go, see your family before you go chasing shadows across half the continent. I'd rather send you out steady than distracted. Farewells were exchanged quickly after that, with the usual courtesies to Cadsuane, a final nod to Leanne, and a brief, respectful word from Logain before he departed with the promise that Grady and Moore would be along shortly and within the hour. And in no time the company stood once more before an open gateway, Camelin's familiar skyline waiting beyond it. The 2 Asherman were shown guest quarters and left to their own devices, while the rest of the group was ushered into Elaine's parlor. It remained the same warm, sunlit room they'd gathered in before, though this time the reunion carried a different weight of urgency and affection tangled together in equal measure. Elaine embraced Rand first, longer than strictly necessary, and Avienda's greeting, a clasped forearm that lingered into something closer to an embrace than either of them would have called it aloud, carried its own form of affection. Tell me everything, Elaine said, once they'd all settled. Tea already being poured. All of it. What that world was like. What you found they did, in pieces, trading the telling back and forth. Moraine on Fate and Eclipso, Tom embellishing the Batcave's strangeness with visible relish, Matt recounting Gotham's game store with the enthusiasm of a man who still hadn't fully processed his own good fortune. Elaine and Avienda listened with rapt, occasionally disbelieving attention, especially at the mention of a man who fought crime dressed as a bat, or the green alien who came from another planet and fought side by side on occasion with this Batman. Rand, for his part, waited until the conversation had settled before producing the gifts he'd carried carefully across 2 worlds. The glass bull and roses for Elaine, who turned it over in her hands with quiet, genuine delight the moment he explained its significance. the box of oils and soaps for Avienda, who accepted it with feigned reluctance and a smile that gave away exactly how pleased she actually was. Last, he crossed to where the twins were on the carpet playing and knelt among them, producing the two soft bears John had pressed into his hands back in the cave. Tam seized his immediately, thoroughly delighted with the stuffed animal, while Morgase, with rather less ceremony, promptly tried to eat hers. "A friend gave these to me," Rand said quietly, watching them with something unguarded settling over his face. "Thought you two might need something to hold on to." Elaine, watching from across the room, said nothing at all, though the look she gave him needed no words to carry its weight. The hours that followed passed easily, the kind of ordinary, unhurried afternoon Courtney was beginning to understand this whole group needed more of than they usually allowed themselves. But it couldn't last indefinitely, and by evening Elaine had already called for a scribe, dictating a letter with the crisp efficiency of a woman well practiced in diplomacy. "To Lord Galad and Lady Berelaine of Mayenne," she said, pacing slowly as she spoke. "This is to inform you that a company will be arriving shortly to look into the troubles you reported to the White Tower, and that they carry the full authority and trust of both the Crown of Andor and Tar Valon in doing so." She paused, glancing toward Rand. "That should smooth the way enough. Galad won't stand on ceremony longer than he has to, not once he understands what's actually at stake." "Let's hope not," Rand said. "We've little enough time to spare as it is." The letter was sealed and sent by gateway immediately, and by the time the household settled for the evening, the shape of tomorrow's departure was already fixed. Mayenne, and whatever waited for them there, drawing steadily closer with every hour that passed. Chapter 17. Brothers of Blood. They waited the better part of the morning for Constantine to make his way from Tar Valon to Camelin, and once he'd arrived, cigarette already lit and entirely unbothered by having kept anyone waiting, the company gathered at the gateway and stepped through to the platform shared by Mayenne and Tyr. A Mayenne honor guard stood ready on the other side, falling into escort formation with practiced efficiency, leading them through several blocks of the city's wealthier quarter. Clean stone, well-kept gardens, and the unmistakable hum of a harbor city that had found its footing again, now that its long-standing feud with Tyr was dead and buried. Rand walked the distance mostly in silence, and Courtney noticed, without needing to ask, a particular tension sitting in his shoulders. "You haven't seen him," Moiraine said quietly, falling into step beside him. "Since Sheol Ghul or Merilaw, no." Rand's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't know what to expect from him. We didn't really have much use for one another when I did spend some time meeting him on my way to becoming the dragon. Whatever else he is," Moiraine said, "he is still your brother, and you are not walking in there alone." She rested a hand briefly on his arm, steady and certain. "None of us are letting you do that." Rand let out a slow breath, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, and nodded once before squaring himself toward the gates ahead. The throne room was smaller than Camelin's, but no less formal for it. Twin thrones set at equal height, a clear and deliberate statement in a court that could easily have been otherwise. Berelain Sir Paindrag sat on one, composed and sharp-eyed as ever, while Galad Damodred sat the other straight-backed, his bearing carrying every bit of the discipline he had shown as a teenager and later as an officer with the Children of Light. The company bowed in turn, murmured thanks for the hospitality extended, and endured perhaps 5 full minutes of formal pleasantries before Berelain, with the particular efficiency of a ruler who'd never had much patience for ceremony beyond what necessity demanded, rose from her throne. "Court is adjourned," she announced, to the visible relief of at least half the room. "Come, we'll speak properly, without an audience listening to every word." The parlor she led them to was considerably warmer than the throne room, with sunlight filtering through tall windows and refreshments already being arranged by the time they'd all found seats. Both Berelain and Galad, it quickly became clear, had heard a great deal about the events of the past year and were eager for the fuller account. "The whole world has heard some version of what happened in Soundar," Berelain said, leaning forward with open curiosity. "You Stargirl, a stranger from beyond the pattern itself, defeating an ancient evil, that had taken root there. I confess I'd assumed half of it was embellishment. Most of it wasn't, unfortunately, Courtney said, with a small, wry smile. And I really can't take much credit, as Cosmo did most of the actual work. And I wouldn't have made it through any of it without Rand and Matt backing me up. She undersells herself considerably, Tom put in, settling into the telling with the unmistakable relish of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this opening. He carried them through the broad strokes of their brief time on Courtney's world. The Batcave's strangeness, Bruce Wayne's clipped efficiency, John's quiet, ancient grief, painting it all with just enough flourish to hold the room without straying into outright embellishment. Berelane's attention, part-way through, drifted toward Constantine, who had been lounging in his chair with his usual unbothered ease. "And you," she said, "what precisely is your role in all this?" "Professional troubleshooter, love," Constantine said, with the particular charm he reserved for exactly this kind of audience. "Demons, dimensional nasties, the occasional cosmic entity with delusions of grandeur. It's all in a day's work, really. Someone's got to handle the bits your Aes Sedai and Usherman weren't quite built to." Berelane's answering smile suggested she found him equal parts amusing and faintly dangerous, which Courtney suspected was more or less the exact reaction he was going for. Across the room, Galad caught Rand's eye and offered the barest nod toward a side door, an invitation, quiet and deliberate, to step away from the gathering. The antechamber was small, plain, and blessedly free of the weight of an audience. Galad closed the door behind them, and for a long moment simply studied his half-brother in silence. "You look tired," Galad said finally. "I usually am these days." Rand managed a faint, humorless smile. "How are you finding Mayene? Ruling a nation you never imagined ruling." "Better than I expected, if I'm honest." Galad moved to the window, looking out over the harbor below. "There's less intrigue here than I braced myself for. Less than Camelin, certainly, and less than the White Tower's politics ever were. Now that the worst of the friction with Tyr has mended, I find I actually have room to simply govern, make people's lives better in small, steady ways. It suits me more than I expected it to." "I'm glad," Rand said, and meant it. He hesitated, then pushed forward before he could talk himself out of it. "Galad, I owe you an apology. I never took the time to come find you after the last battle, to get to know you properly. I found out we shared a mother far too late to have made proper use of the knowledge, and then, well, everything happened so fast, the war, nearly dying, and then coming back in Moradin's body. I've been trying to work out who I even was afterward. I let it become an excuse not to reach out to you, or to anyone for that matter, outside my wives and my children." Galad was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "It was difficult to digest when I first learned who you were to me," he admitted. "More difficult still once I understood what you were to Elaine, and what the two of you meant to each other. I won't pretend I came to any of it easily." He paused. "It was Gorwyn in the end who changed my mind. Before he died, he told me the truth of it, what you were, what you weren't, and asked me to forgive you the years I'd spent believing otherwise." Rand's expression flickered, something raw passing behind his eyes at Gawain's name. "And there was Perrin," Galad continued. "You grew up with him, and I've come to respect few men in this world more than I respect Perrin Ibarra. And eventually it struck me that his judgment of you was almost certainly worth more than every rumor I'd swallowed whole in Camelin or as a child of the light. A man like that doesn't stand beside evil and call it brother." Something in Rand's chest eased, slow and genuine. "I'd like that to change," he said, "once this is behind us. Whatever's waiting at Rudian, at Dragonmount, and wherever this ends, I'd like to get actually know you properly. And I'm sure Elaine wants her step-brother back, and my children ought to know their uncle." Galad's mouth curved into something that was almost, finally, a real smile. He crossed the room and set a hand briefly on Rand's shoulder. Brief, but solid. The kind of gesture that carried more than its size suggested. "Then let that be settled once this business is finished." He straightened, some of his old formality returning, though gentler now than it had been before. For now, though, I think we've been away long enough. Let's go find out what's been troubling my kingdom. Chapter 18. A single shard. By the time Rand and Galad rejoined the others, Berylane had already brought Pat, Courtney, and Tom up to speed on what little the Crown itself understood of the unrest. There were reports coming in of a handful of merchants, dock workers, and otherwise unremarkable individuals who had begun agitating rebellion with no coherent grievance behind it. "It doesn't fit," Berylane said, arms crossed, clearly still turning the problem over, even as she spoke it aloud. "We've spent 2 years building something real here. Real trust, real partnership between Mayane and Tear, and the small folk know it. They've stopped asking whether it will last and started building around the assumption that it will. For this to erupt now, with no cause anyone can point to," she shook her head, "I don't believe it's organic unrest. I think something's been done to these people." "That matches what we've come to expect," Moiraine said, already drawing the golden compass from her belt. She held it flat in her palm, murmuring something low under her breath, and the shifting symbols along its face steadied, then swung all at once toward a fixed and certain point. "Southwest," she said, turning slightly to orient herself against the harbor's skyline. "Not far by the feel of it, and close enough to walk if I judge the distance correctly." "Then we go now, while there's still light to work with," Rand said. He looked around the gathered group. "Moiraine, myself, Matt, Courtney, and Constantine will go. 5 is enough for this, so no sense marching half a palace guard through the streets and giving whoever's behind this time to scatter." "Agreed," Berylane said. "Whatever you need from us, you have it. Just bring me an answer." They set out within the half hour, the compass steady in Moiraine's hand, leading them through progressively quieter streets until they reached a narrow, unremarkable building tucked between a shuttered warehouse and a row of dockworkers' tenements. Nothing about its location suggesting trouble supposedly could be brewing inside. "Right," Constantine said, already sizing up the building with a professional eye. "Before we go charging in blind, someone ought to have a proper look first." His gaze settled on Matt. "Fancy a bit of quiet work?" "Always," Matt said, grinning. Constantine murmured a short, low incantation, and Matt's footsteps went utterly silent, the faint creak of a loose board beneath his boot simply vanishing. Any sound swallowed whole before they could carry an inch. Matt gave an approving nod and slipped off toward the building's side entrance, disappearing into the shadows with the particular ease of a man who'd spent a fair portion of his life sneaking into places he had no business being. He was back within 10 minutes, his expression unusually serious for once. 5 on the ground floor, all asleep, sprawled about like they'd been drinking themselves stupid, though I didn't smell any wine on them, he reported quietly. 2 more upstairs and in the same condition. No lookouts posted, which tells me they're either careless or whatever's controlling them doesn't think it needs lookouts. The latter, likely, Moiraine said grimly. Fear does not occur to those no longer entirely themselves. Rand's expression hardened. Then we don't give them the chance to wake up organized. He glanced at the others. Force, instead of stealth, in and out, fast and clean. He raised one hand toward the door, and it simply ceased to exist. No crash, no splintering wood, just a doorway where a door had been a heartbeat before. Rand stepped through first, with Matt and Courtney close behind him, Cosmo already glowing bright in her grip. The 5 men on the ground floor woke to chaos and barely managed to rise before it was over. Their movements carried the same heavy, subdued wrongness Courtney remembered from Siandar. Slower than they should have been, sluggish in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, though not nearly so far gone as the poor souls they'd found in that city's throne room. Matt's Ashendare spun through the room in a series of quick, economical strikes, disarming 2 before they'd fully found their feet and dropping a third with a clean blow to the temple. Courtney raised Cosmo and twin blasts of cold. Brilliant starlight caught the remaining 2 square in the chest. sending them crashing backward into unconsciousness before either could so much as cry out. Rand was already moving for the stairs, taking them two at a time with Constantine and Moiraine close behind. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived in the upper room, it held only an open window and curtains still fluttering from a hasty escape. "Gone!" he called down, frustration sharp in his voice. "Bolted the moment the fighting started below." "Let them run," Moiraine said, already moving methodically through the ground floor room, the compass held out before her, its symbols pulsing steadily brighter, the closer she drew to a cluttered table near the room's far wall. There, resting among scattered papers and half-empty cups, sat a single black shard. The shard was dark and faintly glistening against the ordinary clutter around it. She drew on a pair of thin leather gloves before lifting it, handling the fragment with the same careful precision she might have given a coiled snake, and set it into the sealed box that already held the others they'd recovered. "One shard," she said, straightening. "Enough to seed unrest in a handful of susceptible minds, but not enough, I think, to have spread much further." Rand came back down the stairs, some of the tension easing from his shoulders now that the fight was won and the shard secured. "Then it's done here." They returned to the palace as the sun sank low over the harbour, and Berylin and Galad received the news with visible, unguarded relief. "A single device," Berylin repeated, turning the words over like she still couldn't quite believe how small the actual cause had been against how large the fear had grown. "That's all it took to make 2 years of trust look ready to collapse overnight." "That's rather the nature of it," Constantine said. "Evil often doesn't take much when it's aimed right. Small wrongness, planted deep enough, does more damage than an army some days." Rand nodded as he recalled how much fear and poison someone carving the symbol of a dragon's fang into a door could create in a community before he sealed away the Dark One for good. "The men responsible will wake with no memory of the last several days, most likely," Moiraine added. "I'd suggest leniency when they do." "They were not acting of their own will." Galad nodded slowly. "Then leniency they'll have." He glanced between the assembled group, something like genuine gratitude settling into his expression. "You've done Mayene and Terra service tonight that neither city will properly know to thank you for. I intend to know it, at least." The sky outside had gone fully dark by the time the formalities wound down, and Berylin, ever practical, waved off any further ceremony. "Rooms have already been prepared for all of you. Rest tonight, as whatever waits for you next, you'll want to meet it steady." There was no argument to be had. The company dispersed to their quarters with the particular bone-deep tiredness that came only after a fight properly won, and Mayene, for the first time in weeks, settled into a night that felt, at last, entirely its own again. Chapter 19. What waited in Rudian. They left Mayene at first light, farewells brief but warm, and Galad's hand lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary on Rand's shoulder before they parted. A few miles beyond the city walls, in a quiet stretch of scrubland, Rand navigated to with the ease of long memory, stood a weathered stone pillar, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift faintly if looked at too directly. "A portal stone," Moiraine said, studying it with open interest. "I confess I hadn't expected to encounter one on this particular errand, while either you or I could have opened a gateway directly there. My memories told me of this stone being here," Rand said, already tracing one of the symbols with a fingertip, murmuring under his breath as he worked through the sequence from memory. "And this one I know well enough to trust to take us straight to its twin outside the city." The air around the stone rippled, and reality flickered twice, and for Rand, Moiraine, Tom, Matt, Courtney, Pat, and Constantine, the world briefly doubled around them before snapping back into a single solid reality. And once fully oriented, they found themselves stationed in the vast, sun-baked expanse of the Isle Waste, with Rudian's angular towers rising in the distance. "Ah," Constantine said, squinting against the harsh light. "This is a lovely spot for a holiday." A small delegation of wise ones met them at the city's edge, women who had chosen to remain behind while so many of their sisters ventured into what the Isle still called, with a mixture of wonder and unease. The wetlands, Randall Thor, the lead wise one, said, and there was real warmth beneath the formality of it. It has been too long. Her gaze then moved to Myraine, and something in her whole bearing eased further still, the particular ease of two women who had trusted each other with more than either had ever trusted most of the world. Moraine, I wondered how long it would take before you came to see me in person rather than sending word through lesser channels. I would have come sooner if the world had allowed it, Moiraine said, something unusually soft in her voice. It's good to see you too, old friend. Amy's attention shifted last to Courtney, one eyebrow lifting with open, unguarded curiosity rather than suspicion. And this will be the stranger we have heard of from beyond the world. I wondered if we would see you while you were here. Courtney quickly introduced the others, speaking of her stepfather as a mechanical genius who builds things, and then over to Constantine, who is a master of magic in her world. They nodded to the wise one in polite courtesy. Moran then began. Word reached the tower that something has been troubling Rue Dion, focused now on the business at hand, though the warmth of a moment before hadn't entirely left her. Something that has been interfering with the rebuilding, I believe. Amy's mouth thinned all business now as well. Troubling is one word for it. Our sisters who walk the dream have spoken of a wrongness they cannot name, tools that break without cause, structures that should stand collapsing overnight, workers waking exhausted despite full night's rest, as though something unseen drains the strength from them while they sleep. We have searched the city itself and found nothing to explain it. She fixed her gaze on the sealed box Moiraine carried at her belt. If you have come with answers, Moiraine, I would hear them plainly. We believe shards from a great evil have found their way here, Moiraine said. The same kind you may have heard rumor of elsewhere in the world these past months. We've come to find them and remove them. Amy's considered this for a long moment before giving a single, sharp nod. Then go carefully. Whatever moves within those walls, it does not want to be found. Her gaze lingered a moment longer on Moiraine, something almost fond beneath the seriousness. And come find me again after, whatever you learn. Not merely to report, but also to talk as we once did. I intend to, Moiraine said. They entered Rue Dion as the sun climbed higher, the city's strange, glassy towers casting long shadows across half-rebuilt streets, with construction scaffolding standing abandoned in places and tools left scattered where exhausted hands had simply given up for the day. Moraine held the compass out before her as they walked, its symbols drifting lazily until, without warning, they snapped into sudden, urgent alignment, pointing deeper into the city's heart. Close, she said, voice low. Closer than I expected, the attack came without warning. A guttural roar split the quiet, and from the shadowed mouth of a side street, a pack of Trollocs surged forward. Goat-snouted, wolf-headed, the same twisted, misshapen mockery of men Courtney had fought once alongside Perrin outside the Two Rivers. She was familiar enough now that her body moved before her mind had to catch up. Behind them came something worse. A Myrddraal, pale and eyeless and utterly silent, its presence alone enough to make the air feel colder. And above, dropping from the towers with a shriek that raised the hair on Courtney's arms, came a pair of dragcar, leathery wings spread wide against the sun. Shadow spawn, Rand snarled, already moving. A blade of pure, hard-edged fire forming in his grip, as if he'd never once needed a sword to begin with. This far south, and this long after the last battle. Questions later, Matt shouted, his ashen doré already spinning, catching the first Trolloc across the throat in a single, brutal arc. Courtney raised Cosmo and the staff blazed to life, throwing back a Trolloc's swing with a burst of cold starlight before she drove the blade tip through its chest. Beside her, Stripe rushed forward in a hasty burst of golden light from Cosmo's own reserve, closing the distance to the Myrddraal in 3 heavy strides, with his plated fist crashing into the creature with bone-jarring force, even as its bladeless sword hissed through the air in answer. Constantine, meanwhile, had already thrown up both hands, chanting fast and low, and overhead one of the dragcar shrieked as invisible force wrenched it sideways out of the sky. the spell slamming it into the side of a half-built tower, hard enough to end the fight before it properly began. The second dove for Moiraine, who met it with a lash of fire that caught it mid-wing, sending it spiraling down in a smoking heap. The Murdroll proved the more stubborn fight, Pat's armored fists absorbing blow after blow that would have felled an ordinary man outright until Rand's power-wrought blade finally neatly removed it of its head. The creature folded all at once into the same unnatural thrashing that always followed a Fade's death, as though it hadn't registered that it was dead yet. The last of the Trollocs fell moments later, Mat's Ashen Dare and Courtney's staff working in brutal, efficient tandem until the street stood silent again, littered with the twisted shapes of the dead. "Everyone all right?" Rand called, breathing hard while surveying the group. A round of nods answered him. Nothing worse than a few scrapes. With Pat's suit dented but functional, Constantine was already lighting a cigarette with hands that hadn't so much as trembled through the entire fight. Moiraine had already moved to the fallen Murdral, with her compass held out and its symbols pulsing bright and insistent as she knelt beside the creature's finally still form. She drew back one edge of its tattered cloak, and there, tucked into a hidden fold of fabric, sat 3 small black shards, dark and wrong even against the Fade's own unnatural stillness. "Here," she said, "it carried them, whether drawn to their wrongness or set the task of ferrying them toward the city deliberately, I cannot say. But it explains a great deal, left over from the war," Rand said grimly, watching her work the fragments carefully into the sealed box with gloved hands. Shadow spawn that never went mad after the fighting was over, or who never cared to stop. "Either way," Moiraine said, straightening the box once more sealed and secure. "The source is found. 3 shards drawing whatever strength Rudian's people have been losing these past weeks. Once we remove them, I expect the wrongness lifts with them." Amy's received the news at the city's edge, and something in her whole bearing eased the moment Moiraine finished the account. Not the careful relief of a stranger reassured, but the plain, unguarded relief of someone who'd been genuinely worried for a friend as much as for her city. 3 small stones, she said, causing so much unexplained grief. She studied the sealed box for a long moment, then looked back to Moiraine, warmth returning fully now that the business of it was done. "You've done what you came to do, and the wise ones will watch closely over the coming days to be sure the wrongness has truly lifted. But I trust your instincts on this as much as I ever have. That trust has rarely steered either of us wrong," Moiraine said, something almost like a smile touching her mouth. "Rarely," Amys agreed, dryly. She reached out and clasped Moiraine's forearm, brief but genuine. "Go carefully wherever this road takes you next, old friend. And when it's finished, truly finished, come back and sit with me properly. Not as Aes Sedai and Wise One, but as the 2 women who once sat outside a sweat, tenned in the waste, and finally admitted, we were both wondering the same thing at the same time." "I'll hold you to that," Moiraine said quietly. They took their leave as the sun began its long slide toward evening. The sealed box, now heavier, with 3 more fragments than it had been earlier that morning. And Moiraine's compass, when she checked it one final time before they departed, had already begun drifting toward a new and final direction entirely, northwesterly, and up towards the distant, unmistakable silhouette of Dragonmount itself. Chapter 20. What the mountain remembers, Moraine's compass had settled hours before into a fixed and certain heading, its shifting symbols finally gone still. It pointed not toward some hidden corner of the world, but straight up toward the vast, snow-crowned shape of Dragonmount itself. Rand stood before them at its base, one hand raised, and for the first time since Courtney had known him, he hesitated before opening a gateway. Not from any lack of strength, but from something else entirely. Something in his features that looked for just a moment, like a man steadying himself before stepping into his own memory. "Give me a moment," he said, quiet, and no one argued. He looked up at the mountain rising before them, and when he spoke again, it was to all of them, not just to himself. Something Courtney understood, without needing to be told, was not a thing the old Rand would ever have done. Luz Therin made this mountain, he said. In his madness, at the end of the War of Power, the poison already deep in him, Seddon already turning against every man who touched it. And this was the last terrible thing he made before the end. A father who'd just killed his own family, unable to bear what he'd done, tearing the world open with grief and madness in the same breath. This is what that looked like, still looks like 3,000 years later. He paused, something old and tired passing behind his eyes. I was born on its slopes, my mother dying in the snow, carrying me the last of the way before she couldn't carry me any further. I didn't choose this mountain. It chose me, the same way it chose him long before either of us understood what we were. Moraine watched him with quiet, careful attention. Matt, for once, said nothing at all. It took me most of my life to understand the truth of it, Rand continued, that he and I were never two souls fighting for the same body the way I believed for so long. The way I needed to believe, because the alternative terrified me more than the war itself did. We were one R1, his madness, his grief, his love, all of it mine the same way this mountain has always, in some sense, been mine, whether I wanted the inheritance or not. He looked around at them all. Moiraine, Tom, Matt, Pat, Constantine, Courtney, with something settling into his expression that looked, for the first time, almost like peace. And now we're here to close a door that opened because of what I did, not what he did 3,000 years ago, but what I did 2 years past in sealing the Dark One away. The mountain's first wound and this one are closer kin than I think any of us realized when we started this. He let out a slow breath, and the hesitation finally left him. Let's finish it, he said, and opened the gateway. They stepped through onto a high, wind-scoured ledge near the mountain's peak, its thin air biting cold despite the pale sunlight, and there, embedded deep into a great slab of dark, weathered stone, sat the last of the shards, dozens of them, clustered thick and unmistakable around a single, barely visible seam in the air itself. The breach was smaller than Courtney had expected. No roaring tear, no dramatic wound, just a thin, near-invisible distortion humming faintly with a wrongness that made her teeth ache just standing near it. Dark energy bled off it in slow, patient waves. There, Moiraine said softly, compass, finally, fully still in her hand. That's the source of everything. Constantine was already moving, chalk scraping quickly against stone as he worked a tight, careful circle around the breach itself. He murmured low and fast, old words that made the thin mountain air feel thinner still.
Right,
He said, straightening once the last line was drawn, that'll hold whatever's on the other side from getting any bolder than it already is. It won't hold forever, so best make this quick. Rand knelt and pried the embedded shards free from the stone one by one, adding them to the sealed box Moiraine had carried across half a continent until every last fragment they'd gathered sat together in a single container for the first time since this whole search had begun. He rose and walked to the very edge of the breach, and without further ceremony hurled the box straight through the seam. It vanished without a sound. No flash, no impact, simply gone, swallowed into whatever waited on the other side. Now the hard part, Rand murmured, and raised both hands toward the breach, reaching for the deep, now familiar well of a power that came following the sealing of the Dark One's prison. He drew it up and focused it against the thin, wrongness-soaked seam in the world. For a moment it worked exactly as it should have. The breach, shuddering, narrowing with the wrongness in the air, recoiling like something struck. Then it stopped and began pushing back against him. Rand's jaw clenched with sweat beading on his face despite the mountain's cold, both arms trembling with the effort of holding a line that refused to give any further ground. Something's resisting, he ground out. It's actively fighting back. This isn't like the Dark One. This is aware. Eclipso, Constantine said grimly, already moving. He raised his hands, adding his own strength to whatever ward he could throw up around the strain. Course he'd fight for it. Wouldn't be much of a cosmic menace if he just let the one door he's got slam shut without a word. Courtney didn't wait to be asked, as Cosmo blazed to life in her grip. Stepping up beside Rand, She raised her staff toward the seam and pushed, not with any power from this world, not with anything she fully understood even now, but with whatever ancient, patient opposition Cosmo had always carried toward exactly this kind of darkness. Together, she said, "Come on, Rand, you're not doing this alone." Rand's eyes flicked toward her, something fierce and grateful passing through the strain on his face, and he nodded once. The breach fought them for what felt like an eternity and was probably no more than a handful of minutes. The seam bulged and strained dark energy, lashing out in short, vicious pulses that Constantine's ward barely managed to contain. Cosmo's light and Rand's raw, unbending will pressed against it in a single combined force that refused to yield an inch back. And then, all at once, it broke. The resistance simply vanished. The wrongness in the air, snapping backward like a held breath finally released, and the seam collapsed in on itself with a sound like a whispered word spoken and then instantly forgotten. The mountain's thin, cold air went, at last, entirely still. For a long moment, no one moved. Rand stood with his arms still half raised, breathing hard, staring at the empty space where the breach had been, as though he didn't quite trust it was truly gone. "It's closed," Moiraine said softly, stepping forward and studying the empty air with careful, searching attention. "Truly closed. I can find no trace of it remaining." Rand let his arms fall, and something in his whole body seemed to loosen at once. Not just exhaustion, but the particular bone-deep release of a weight, finally set down after being carried so long it had become indistinguishable from his own shape. "It's done," he said, quiet and disbelieving. He looked around at all of them, Moiraine, Tom, Matt, Pat, Constantine, Courtney, standing together on the mountain that had marked both his birth and his oldest wound, and for the first time since Courtney had known him, he smiled without a single trace of weariness behind it. "It's actually over." Chapter 21. What the World Remembers. The goodbyes on Dragonmount came quickly, as goodbyes after a battle won always seemed to, brief, warm, with everyone still a little unsteady on their feet from what had just passed. Tom clasped Pat's hand and Constantine's in turn, already composing a new epic for this age. Courtney suspected it was the first draft of how he intended to tell this story for the rest of his life. Matt pulled Constantine into a rough, one-armed embrace and promised, with real sincerity beneath the usual grin, that the drink they'd shared in Blue Valley wouldn't be their last. Moraine's farewell to Courtney was quieter, more measured, but no less genuine. A small, private smile and a promise, unspoken but understood, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Rand's goodbye came last and lasted longest. "I don't have the words for what you did for me," he said, quiet enough that it felt like it belonged only to the two of them, even standing in a small crowd. "Not just today. Since the moment you first fell into our world and decided, for reasons I still don't fully understand, that our problems were worth making your own." "That's just what people who care about each other do," Courtney said. "Even across whole universes, apparently." Rand huffed something that was almost a laugh. "I used to think the weight I carried was mine to bear alone, that there wasn't room for anyone else to help hold it." He glanced back once at the mountain behind them, then back at her. "You and Cosmo and everyone who came with you, you proved that wrong more than I think you'll ever know. Thank you for all of it. Go home," Courtney said, throat a little tight. "Go see your kids. Give Elaine an Avienda, my love. And Rand," she caught his eye, "let yourself finally rest. You've earned it." "I'll try," he said, and for once it sounded like he actually meant it. Cosmo hummed, warm and steady, and Rand raised one hand to help thread the last of its power into the shape of a gateway. Blue Valley was waiting on the other side, quiet and green and ordinary. Courtney, Pat, and Constantine stepped through it together, and the portal sealed shut behind them with its familiar final hush, leaving Dragonmount's peak to settle back into its long, ancient silence. In Ebo Dar, the Terracin Palace's private study had gone quiet with the particular contentment of a long evening winding down. A chessboard between Matt and Tuon, bearing the marks of a match well into its middle stages. "You've gotten better," Matt said, studying the board with visible suspicion. "Suspiciously better." I have had an excellent teacher and considerable time to practice while you were off saving multiple worlds, Chuon said, moving a bishop with unhurried precision. Check, I believe. Matt groaned and studied the board with fresh scrutiny. This has been, without question, the strangest year of my life. And I have had some genuinely strange years. That, Tuon said, is not in dispute. She sat back, studying him for a long moment, something more serious settling beneath her usual composure. Matt, I have been thinking, should we remain here ruling from Ebo Dar, or should we return properly to Siandar and rule from where my throne was always meant to sit? Matt considered the question with more gravity than he usually allowed himself. Siandar is home for you, no question. I know that, but... He gestured vaguely at the board, the room, the whole strange, settled life they'd built here. There's something to be said for where we've actually made a life together instead of just where the crown says we're supposed to sit. And remember, you came back to the mainland based off a prophecy that someday your people would. A fair point, Tuon said with her mouth curved, faint and thoughtful. Perhaps there's no need to decide tonight. Perhaps we should simply decide together when the time actually comes, rather than letting an empty throne make the choice for us. Now that, Matt said, sounds like a plan I can get behind. He moved his own piece, entirely too pleased with himself. Checkmate, by the way. Tuon studied the board, genuinely startled, and Matt's grin widened into something thoroughly insufferable. In Camelin, Elaine and Avienda returned to the parlor as the day's court business, finally, mercifully concluded. Both of them sinking into chairs with the particular exhaustion of women who'd spent hours managing other people's problems and were now grateful to simply sit. The world feels different, Elaine said, after a long, comfortable silence, staring at nothing in particular. I can't quite name how. It's all just different since all of this began. Since her Avienda considered that, turning it over with her usual care before answering. Smaller, she said finally. Not lesser, only smaller. The way a room feels smaller once you have seen what lies beyond its walls. We knew the Dark One. We knew the shadow, the blight, the shape of every danger our own histories prepared us to expect. She looked toward the window, toward the sky beyond it. Now we know there is a great deal more sky than we ever accounted for. That is not a comfortable thing to know, but I do not think it is an unwelcome one either. No, Elaine agreed softly. Strange as it is to admit, I don't think it is. She reached over and Avienda took her hand without hesitation, and for a while neither of them said anything further at all, content simply to sit together in a world that had, in ways neither could fully articulate, quietly become larger than it had ever been before. In Tarvalon, Logain sat across from Cadsuane in her study, a scattering of proposals spread between them. Joint ventures between the Black Tower and White Tower, they both had been quietly circling for months. Uses of Sedin and Sadar working in tandem that neither order had ever seriously attempted before now. The world feels different, Cadsuane said, echoing a thought she hadn't realized was so widely shared, setting down the page she'd been reviewing. I've lived more years than most Logain and outlasted more changes than I care to count. And still, something about this age feels genuinely new. Not merely different in the way one century differs from the last, but new in a way I find myself struggling to fully account for. She allowed herself a rare, dry admission. Perhaps I am simply becoming too old in my ways to properly comprehend it. I doubt that, Logain said. I think more likely we've all simply learned the world is larger than the wheel ever taught us to expect. He leaned back, considering his next words carefully. The light and the pattern have always known more than we do, Cadsuane, and I have to imagine they knew this was coming long before any of us did, and that they'll know too if this world ever needs help again. A faint, knowing smile crossed his face. And if it does, I suspect we already know where to look. There's a world out there with a girl and a staff who'll be exactly where we need them to be, whenever that day comes. Cadsuane studied him for a long moment, then allowed herself the barest hint of a smile in return, small but genuine, the kind she rarely spent on anyone. Let us hope, she said. That day is a long time coming, and outside her window the White Tower stood exactly as it always had, ancient and unshaken, holding watch over a world that had, in every quiet way that mattered, already begun to turn toward whatever came next.